Chapter 1 Infernos poured down from the vent, gliding as if liquid silver instead of conventional flames. They sizzled as they twirled in the atmosphere, drifting slowly to the steel floor. At first the fire seemed to shrink back from the cold metal surface upon contact, but as the steel began to glow from heat, the infernos spread out. They twisted and curled upward into an elongated column. As they rose, a shape began to form. It started as a rough humanoid outline and became more human with each passing second, until it was clearly that of a young woman with long flowing hair. She would have looked quite normal and perhaps a bit comely, or she not composed entirely of sentient flame. Then, with no warning at all, the fire disappeared, and only the young woman remained. She turned her head with great care, taking in every detail of the vault that encased her. It was a massive structure, one that had taken no less than 3 months of planning and to accomplices to break into. Even with her special abilities, lasers, alarms, pressure switches, heat sensors, and a myriad of cameras were just some of the obstacles she'd overcome. And now she was in their deepest sanctum. No near trinkets were housed in this tomb of titanium, no coins or jewels. No, this was a central vault for Indigo Technologies, a leader in every industry that involved circuits or switches. Everything they released managed to be years ahead of their competitors. With the prototypes and plans available here, she would be able to advance her own research by decades, as well as make a tidy profit. Finally, she could begin funding her own projects. All it would take was a bit of corporate espionage to get her off the ground. She stepped forward with impossible care, by sweeping for some new trap ready to spring out at her. None of her considerable bribes, thieving, or threats had secured her information about the vault's interior defenses. So from this point on, she was flying blind. There was no way Indigo would stop at merely protecting the outside, though that much she was sure of. She crept toward one of the nearest walls, constantly on alert. When she reached it without incident, she tenderly opened the first drawer she could reach. It was metallic like all the box drawers she could see, and slid out from its nearly seamless integration in the wall. With a simple touch, the marking on its front, CX9-315, was gibberish to her, but she had to start the search somewhere. Perhaps she would get lucky and glean some sense of what the filing system meant from the box's contents, and if not, she would just keep searching blind. Inside drawer CX9-315 was a single piece of paper. Clearly this project hadn't gotten very far off the ground, but if its mere concept was in a place this secure, that it had to be worth taking. She pulled the paper up to read it, unable to contain her curiosity. Curiosity was her fatal flaw, one that had resulted in her gaining her fire powers several years prior. But what made her eyes was not a project plan, or a design schematic, or even a rough sketch. Instead, it was two words in a bold, formal font centered on the page. "Well done." "The hell," she muttered, despite the fact that she was keenly aware of exactly what the hell was going on before she heard the vent system seal up, or saw the glowing orbs crackling with energy rise from hidden compartments, or felt the sudden dip in temperature. Before all of that, she knew she was undone from the words alone. Someone had known she was coming, and Indigo Technologies was not the sort of company that failed to prepare for a guest appropriately. "This is interesting," said a new voice, one coming from everywhere in the room, yet at the same time from no single spot. It was a male voice, older, but not quite at the cost of aged. Rather than sounding upset or accusing, it seemed amused. That more than anything else set her teeth on edge. Angry people could be predicted. Their actions would fall in the realm of reason. Someone amused, sounding like they'd found a new toy, could herald true horrors in store for her. "Did you know that when we set this little trap for you, I was the only one who believed you had the skills to spring it? Everyone else thought you'd be snared by the lasers with the coolant cannons. Only I believed you had what it would take to make it all the way here, trying to make me feel thankful." She held the paper firmly in hand, and it burst into infernos. The fire spread up her hand to her elbow. Within seconds there was nothing left but ash. Undone or not, she had no intention of going down gently. "None of that now. I was trying to tell you that you've just won me several $1,000s in bragging rights. This means at the moment I am rather predisposed to like you, while my underlings are significantly miffed. You should probably just go along with things, because the other options in front of you are far less pleasant." At his words, the temperature in the vault dropped noticeably. She suspected that if she'd had a normal tongue and pressed it to the metal walls, it would have stuck. "Maintain your infernos grew significantly more difficult But she persevered. She would not show weakness, not even if that was her final act of defiance. All things considered, if I have to die, then I think I'd like to wreck as many of your toys as I can on my way out. She spat. Die. Who on earth mentioned dying? Dear child, this is an opportunity. You just called it a trap. The infernos spread farther along her arms even as the temperature continued to drop. It's that, to a trap, an opportunity. And in addition, we've had an eye on you for some time, Torai Rivas. We wanted to see just what you were capable of. Given a bit of information and some competent cronies, Geraldine and Cooper, they work for you. You set this whole thing up. We gave you resources. You were the one who decided how to use them, and to that effect you used them very well. Breaking into this vault is no small feat. We designed it not to be. Why go to all this trouble? Why didn't you just approach me with a grant or a job offer? Torai asked, looking up at the ceiling vaguely. Since there was no physical person to direct your questions toward, Indigo Technologies is huge and well funded. I'd have taken a job. Well, she'd have pretended to accept and then used her access to find a much easier way into the vault. At any rate, Ms. Rivas, there is so very much to bring you up to speed on. Suffice it to say that we wanted to test far more than your ability to punch a clock and boil some coffee. Plus, we're well aware of your opinion toward conventional occupations. At any rate, I'd love to continue this discussion. However, you have yet to make a decision about what. Her voice slept, and the fire flashed on her arms. Cold could dampen the physical capabilities of her power, but it held no dominion over the temper burning inside her. About your future, you are smart, talented, determined, and powerful. We have taken notice of you and of your potential. At this point, there are two ways we can regard you: as an asset or a threat. Assets, or tempered, trained, and cultivated threats, or eliminated. Do it, then call the capes. Let's see you explain your little mousetrap to them when they come get me. I'm sure some of the shit in here is illegal. I did not say threats were incarcerated. I said threats were eliminated. The floating orbs glowed more brightly. The temperature had fallen well below freezing. It would be impossible to fully transform in here now, and obviously her captain knew it. You can't do this. You're just a corporation. You don't get to kill whoever you want. A better grasp of America's history in third world nations and its handling of union debacles would tell you just how wrong that statement is in general. But let's focus on the point that's most salient to our discussion. We are far from just a corporation. Talking time is done. Ms. Rivas, you have a choice to make. Torai stared at the orbs, wondering if she could take them out. As cold as it was, she rather doubted it. But anything was possible. One never knew how a fight would end until it was over. That's what her father had always taught her. Still, even if she took out the orbs, they were bound to have other things, worse things, waiting in the wings. She didn't want to go down easily, but she also didn't want to die. The infernos on her arms burned away, leaving behind a woman who seemed far smaller and more frightened than she had only seconds before. Does anyone ever take the other option? Torai asked as she watched the orbs vanish back into the walls. More than you might think. Our kind is a stubborn, prideful lot, and many do not take well to being trapped and threatened. Our kind. The vault door open, revealing a tall man in his mid to late 40s adorned in Meta armor. Torai recognized at once. How could she not? It belonged to one of the most famous inventors of the last 100 years and one of the greatest criminals the world had ever seen. It had taken at least 10 capes working in tandem to finally take him down. All that was missing was his trademark helmet, which was why Torai could make out the blue eyes and surprisingly warm smile on his face as he answered her question. Villains, Ms. Rivas, that is our kind. We are villains. Take that vile monster, I smite thee. With the shining light of justice clacking filled the air as then dexterous fingers danced along the keyboard and caused the shining knight on the screen to hack and slash with furious gusto. Each move was precise and calculated, decimating the wicked Minotaur's health faster than the bull-headed being could recover. Victory seemed certain until a gentle but very deliberate cough filled the air. Donald, what are you doing? We've talked about this before. Donald spun around in his chair, one of the few orthopedic ones in the office, until his eyes rested on the tall man staring down at him. Ivan wore his usual pressed dark suit, crisp white shirt, and knotted red tie as he looked at his employee with a mix of weary exasperation and subtle displeasure. I'm just playing a game, Mr. Gerhardt. I didn't break the rules like before. It's my lunch break. and I brought my laptop from home, so I didn't think it would be an issue. Ivan carefully considered the gangly young man in front of him. He could come down hard on Donald, scare the wits out of the poor boy so that he'd never step out of line again. But that would probably put him off working here. Despite his tendencies, Donald was a talented programmer. Even with his knack for getting lost inside projects, he seldom missed a deadline, and the work he produced always ranged from good to excellent. Most managers would say that such things were irrelevant and rules were rules and had to be followed. Ivan had been managing for some time though, and he knew that cultivating resources was more important than being authoritarian. Besides, he had a bit of a soft spot for rule breakers. As long as they stayed within the bounds that he said. Putting an unauthorized computer on the network violates several of Vandali Industries' safety protocols. Ivan said at last that thing could have all manner of viruses, and without the safety software we put on the corporate machines, there would be no way to tell. This was bullshit, pure and simple. The corporate machines had cookie-cutter software that was easy enough for the management to use and cheap enough for the higher UPS to justify. Someone with Donald's skills undoubtedly had a more secure laptop than what the rest of the office was working on. Oh right, I didn't think about that, Donald said. Ivan could see he was lying. Even a man without his background could have read the anxious young man's face. Look, it's a silly rule, but if IT catches wind of you putting that thing on the network, we'll both get an earful. Do you really like playing games that much? It helps me relax, reset my head. I don't want to cause trouble, but this is sort of like my equivalent to a smoke break, Donald said. Ivan nodded empathetically. It was a skill he'd spent years honing to get just right. I can understand that, but at the same time I can't let you break safety protocol, so here's what I'd like to propose. You're on the Elkway project, right? Yes sir, Mr. Gerhardt. That's a big project with a lot of money to be made, so the people up top are keeping a close eye on it. I need someone I can trust watching over the technical side, and Donald, I think you might be the man for that job. Me? Donald's brown eyes widened, stretching so far that for a moment it seemed his eyebrows would make contact with the ends of his stringy red hair. That's right, Donald. That's what I came to talk about. I've had my eye on you for months, and I think this is your time to shine. Ivan carefully rested a hand on the wall of the cubicle, being sure to present body language that spoke to how open and caring he was. The whole department needs this to go well, and I'm a firm believer in the right man for the right job. Part of that job, by the way, will entail needing a personal company laptop. You'd have to use it for all matter of work, and you'd be free to install anything on it so long as it meets the company's general use guidelines. Ivan doubted Donald was stupid enough to watch porn on a company computer, but he also didn't want to have it yelling at him about another hard drive kicked in smut. So I could play games on it when you're not on company time. Yes, so long as they're not inappropriate, you'd be free to use the devices you saw fit. Now tell me, are you interested in the position, or do I move on to Williams? Donald's wide eyes suddenly narrowed. He and Renee Williams hadn't gotten along since they started. Renee was a ruthless kiss-ass who never hesitated to steal credit or throw others under the bus. Ivan might have been inclined to reward such behavior if Renee also had the skills to succeed without others to feed upon, as it was his main purpose was as a motivational tool Ivan could wield against his other employees. The moral and decent didn't want to see Renee Williams make any headway in the company, so much so that they would often take on extra tasks to prevent it. No, sir, Mr. Gerhardt, I want the job, please. Excellent, I'm glad to hear it. I'll put in the form this afternoon. By Thursday, you should be approved. Oh, and I'm sure it goes without saying, but no more breaking protocol. You understand that this is a big opportunity, and a lot of eyes will be upon you, right? Yes, sir. Good man, glad to hear it. Just send me an email if you have any questions. Ivan turned and strode out of the cubicle, an expression of genuine happiness on his face. Whatever manipulative methods he might have used to get his way, Ivan had meant what he said. Donald really was the best man for the job. He was talented, smart, and resourceful, not to mention so terrified of authority that Ivan wouldn't have to put forth much effort to keep him in line. That would make Ivan's job, and therefore his life, easier. He strode into his office, nothing to fancy, just four walls and a door that closed, and sat down at his desk. His computer had gone to sleep While he made his rounds, the dark screen showing his reflection instead of the spreadsheet program he'd left running. Ivan wasn't particularly handsome, though he did appeal to women who liked strong noses and pronounced chins. Both his eyes and hair were quite dark, a feature he'd inherited from his mother and passed on to one of his two children. Despite his age, Ivan looked like he couldn't be much older than his late 20s, a fact that everyone inevitably brought up when they met him. There were a myriad of lies he used to explain the phenomenon. Clean living, regular exercise, liberal use of sunscreen, and excellent genetics, all making regular appearances soon. Though he'd have to think of something else. Looking like this in his early 40s was one thing, but once he was in his 50s, genuine suspicion would be aroused. Perhaps he'd lie and say he'd been doused with an experimental anti-aging serum. It would be strange, but not altogether unbelievable. It was certainly a far cry. Better than telling them the real reason. His body refused to stop being youthful and fit. Ivan glanced down at his desk and noticed the red voicemail indicator on his cell phone blinking. That was curious. Even down the hall he should have heard his ringtone. That's why he felt comfortable leaving the phone in the first place. Picking up the device, he unplugged it from its charger. Damn thing could never last more than half a day. And pressed the button to call his voicemail. As soon as he heard the voice on the other end, everything made sense. Of course, the actual calling process had been bypassed. The message probably wasn't even sent from another phone. More likely a convoluted system meant to bounce around signals and scramble listening devices. Ivan would have dismissed it as paranoia if not for the fact that his friend had excellent reasons to be suspicious of prying ears. With a resolved grunt, Ivan leaned back in his own chair and listened to the message. Ivan, it's Wade. There's something I'm going to need your help with. Not the usual kind either. We've got up. Well, I'll tell you in person tonight. This is me letting you know I'm coming over, so don't try and kill me as soon as I walk on your lawn or anything. See you soon. Ivan set the phone back down and shook his head. One time he'd almost killed Wade, and the man had never let him live it down. You break into someone's lair in the middle of the night and you can't be surprised when they take a swing at you, especially not when that person had a reputation. Like Ivan's. Chapter 2. Ivan lived in a two-story ranch-style house in a suburb of Ridge City. It looked exactly like 6 other houses in his neighborhood, save for the fact that Ivan had selected the beige trim, while the others had gone with eggshell. It was a 4-bedroom with one for Ivan, one that served as a home office, and the remaining 2 were for each of his children. Those were only in use every other weekend, but he liked to have a place for them to feel at home when they came over. In the front was a small patio adorned with a couple of wooden rocking chairs that looked homemade, but had actually been purchased at a local chain store. Between them was a table in the same style, upon which there was a glass of iced tea waiting for Ivan. As he stepped outside, the heat of summer was dying out, giving way slightly to the brisk nip of fall. The battling elements made the evening perfect for sitting out. Enough heat to be warm, paired with just the right amount of breeze to stay cool. As Ivan sipped his tea, he gave a polite nod to Mrs. Jefferson, the elderly neighbor, who was making the trek down her driveway to check her mail. She was a sweet woman, likely a bit too frail to be living alone, but she refused to let a little thing like that stop her. Ivan and the other neighbors pitched in to help with her yard work and keep up her house. The others did so out of good-heartedness and likely a concern for property values if one home became derelict, and Ivan because he had a healthy respect for people who refused to do what they were expected to, even if it came at the cost of their own health. A silver sedan pulled into Ivan's driveway, a familiar copper-haired man behind the wheel. Ivan was grateful that way to come in a normal car. Heaven knew the billionaire had more than enough luxury automobiles to turn heads on this humble little street. Instead, he was driving a nice but not ostentatious car that blended in perfectly with the neighborhood. Of course, knowing Wade, that vehicle was probably rocket-proof, could fly, and had a button that turned it into a robot. But so long as all that stayed hidden, it wasn't any of Ivan's concern. The engine died, and Wade emerged. Unlike Ivan, he was wearing his ears appropriately. Though still tall and lean, a small punch of belly had begun to accumulate around his midsection, no doubt the result of all-nighters filled with eating terrible junk food. His shiny copper hair was thinning and within another decade he likely be bald on top unless he spared a day or so. To find a cure, his eyes were still the same blue and wild and full of life, barely able to contain all the thoughts of the brain behind them. He strolled up the driveway toward the walkway, avoiding Ivan's well-maintained lawn. Despite his wealth, or perhaps because of it, Wade always wore a similar outfit when he was going: mundane jeans, custom shoes that supported his poor arches, and a plaid button-down. Evening, Ivan said, greeting his friend and one of the oldest acquaintances he had. Evening, Wade replied, settling down in the unoccupied rocking chair. Can I get you something to drink? Maybe in a bit. How's life at the office treating you? As Wade spoke, he pulled a small silver box from his pocket. It looked a lot like an oversized lighter, but as with everything else with Wade, looks were incredibly deceiving. Could be worse. At least the shitty economy means I've got a glut of qualified people desperate for work. Beats the hell out of the days when we were snagging any kid who could string 3 lines of code together. Ivan took a drink of cold iced tea, enjoying the excessive sweetness. He made his the old-fashioned way, with enough sugar to cause diabetes in a single glass. Life had taken away many of his vices, but this was one he refused to let go of. Besides, it wasn't as though a thing like sugar could hurt his body. But economy means it's an employer's market. Wade finished fiddling with his box. A small red light ignited near the base. He set it on the table a safe distance away from Ivan's tea and continued, okay, that should do it. I remember when you needed a room the size of my house and machines as big as your car to create your cone of silence. I don't care how much you liked to get smart as a kid. We are not calling it that. It's a portable sound isolation and management system. Yes, your version just rolls off the tongue, Ivan said. He made sure to keep his usual half smile on his face as he spoke. Weed's device would stop all forms of technological eavesdropping. They discovered not to mention distort the movements of their lips to prevent reading, and Ivan had wards all over his property that halted scrying, but none of that would stop people from noticing if they suddenly hunched over and acted secretive. The best way to do nefarious things was right out in the open, as if you had nothing to hide. Now that we're clogged and you're here, tell me what the big news is. I can't already be up in rotation. No, your work last month was superb. However, it left the others a bit uneasy about calling on your services again. That's what I was going for, Ivan replied. Clearly the blood on the ceiling made that point abundantly obvious. I'm here about a different matter. Last week we picked up a new candidate, smart, willful, and with the power that she's barely scratched the surface of. The rest of the board agrees with me that she has tremendous potential. But well, I did say she was willful, didn't I? Yes, you did, very much so. She's not taking direction well. Keeps bucking against us, towing the line, just enough not to fall out of our good graces completely. Some feel she never make the grade, and we're better off cutting our losses. That there's no point in training a future code breaker. Ivan knew all too well what Wade was hinting at, and he was glad he'd made such a spectacle of his last job. He'd do his part, but he preferred that people be scared to call him in. It meant they wouldn't try to use him as some go-to exterminator. Personally, Wade continued, I feel such actions are extreme and unnecessary at this point, but if things don't change, then sooner or later that will be the unavoidable outcome. That's why I contacted you. Standard training isn't working for her, so I thought she might benefit from the old way we learned. Master and apprentice, hold the damn phone, Ivan said, setting down his tea so hard, a bit sloshed over the side. Look, I do what's necessary when I have to, but there is no way I'm going fully back in. Getting joint custody was hard enough. If I get busted, even if we beat it, I'll be lucky to see my kids before they graduate college. Calm down, no one is asking you to come back, Wade assured him. This would be a modified program, no crime necessary on your part. You'd be a mentor, taking her under your wing and teaching her how things work. The rules, how to fight, picking targets, all the theory and legal training. Any real outings will be done by someone else with you in a supervisory capacity at the most. Ivan settled back in his chair and plastered the fake smile back on his face, but the skull in his eyes never quite lessened. Fine, so I wouldn't have to go back in. Why should I do it, though? There are plenty of qualified people in your organization. Hell, you could do it yourself. I'm sure she'd love to study under the great Dr. Mechanismical, sure she would. And the minute I turned my back, she'd either try and steal everything off my hard drive or roast it when she failed. The woman is too smart and ambitious to trust around my lab. Luckily, she's all science-minded. No talent or capacity for magic means you'd have nothing to worry about. Still not explaining why you need me instead of the others. Arcanicus has got to be bored as hell lately, and he's all magic. To Yvonne pointed out, look, eye level with you, she's kind of a pain in the ass. Lots of us could try and train her, but no one wants to. Potential aside, they just don't see her being worthy investment of time and energy to properly mold. Add in the fact that a few folks are probably legitimately scared of her, and it creates a pupil without a suitable teacher, save possibly for you. Why me? Because you're a pain in the ass. To Wade replied there was nothing accusatory in his statement. He told this to Yvonne the same way he'd have given him the time. You're stubborn, temperamental, willful, and you scare the shit out of a lot of members near. As I can see, you're either the perfect teacher for her or you'll kill her in 2 days. Either outcome solves my problem. The prospect was certainly interesting, and Yvonne could probably do with the new project. His last one, woodworking, had ended in a summer bonfire and a trip to purchase the rocking chairs he and Wade were sitting in. Still, an apprentice was a lot of work and a fair amount of responsibility. It had the potential to complicate the life he'd worked so hard to keep nice and serene. I'll accept that I might be a good fit for her, Yvonne said, but that doesn't tell me why I should do it. I'm not the altruistic sort, you know. So you claim. Wade chuckled. He was one of the few people who knew all of Yvonne's sides, the dark and the light. Admittedly, there was ample darkness, but he wasn't an empty monster, at least not unless he had reason to be. I already discussed it with the training board, and we decided that a stipend would be appropriate compensation for your troubles. My job pays fine, as you want to know, so thanks, but no thanks. Fine, sure, but doesn't Rick start applying to college in a few years, Janet? And I have a college fund for both him and Beth. Wade shook his head. Yvonne, you are missing the offer. Rick is a bright boy and Beth is no slouch either. But with their current grades and extracurriculars, they're looking at a good state college, and maybe a bit higher if they do very well on their SATs. I'm offering guaranteed fully paid top-tier admission, literally. Pick a school, and they'll get accepted with a full ride. Rick wants to work for NASA, right? The Ivy League certainly wouldn't look bad on his resume. Malthus came up with this, didn't he? I educate yours, you educate mine. It has the sort of symmetry he loves. It was his suggestion, but I thought the compensation would pique your interest. You've already earned a good, stable life for yourself. I assumed you'd be more inclined to help your children get closer to theirs from anyone else. Yvonne would have taken this as manipulation, and his reaction would not have been kind. Wade was a friend, however, and in their former occupation, friends were a rare thing. He was truly looking out for Yvonne, offering him something that would be unattainable through normal means. Wade was using his knowledge of what Yvonne loved to create a better deal, not to try and con him into accepting against his better judgment. And if Yvonne were being honest with himself, it would take a lot of worry off his shoulders to know his children were getting a good first step into the adult world. I guess I can see what she's got. I've been conceited at last. No promises, though. If I don't think I can teach her, I'm walking away. That's what I want you to do. Anyway, Wade said, I can take you to her now if you're ready. In a minute. Yvonne reached over and picked up his glass. First, I want to finish my tea. The skeleton let out a pathetic wail as the fireball struck its rib cage, exploding and shattering it into dozens of pieces. Nearby, another skeleton was caught by surprise as its target unleashed a torrent of flame that caused its bones to blacken and crack and shortly become too frail to hold together. More skeletons marched up to fill the ranks of their fallen brothers. They were many, but their opponent was strong. Strong and dangerous. Almost makes me feel bad for the things, Yvonne said, staring at the monitor as another trio of skeletons was taken out. She's able to destroy them nearly as fast as Arcticus can conjure them. Wade said on another monitor they could see an older man, probably a decade ahead of Wade, wearing robes and weaving magical symbols in the air. Every couple of seconds the symbols would form together, and a new skeleton would appear in front of him. The man would point to a door, and the skeleton would totter through to its fiery destruction. Not much thought behind her moves, Yvonne commented. She's just throwing fireballs and blast streams. They're good range attacks, But what about up close? Died wager. That's why she's in her fire form, Wade replied. Torai was indeed composed entirely of infernos. She looked more like a tall inferno that happened to be human-shaped than a woman who had changed her molecular chemistry. It's a potent ability, not overwhelming in strength, but with lots of versatility. Yvonne said the guild seriously wants to be done with her. So soon. Wade nodded, the gesture a bit stiff and weary. Smart and strong as she is, Torai has also been steadily refusing to take her education seriously. We try and teach her about strategy, secrecy, and of course the code. But she keeps digging in her heels. From what I've gathered, she spent the last decade or so subsisting off of petty crime and a network of other crooks. Most of the ones pulled in to teach her feel she's too far gone. That all we're doing right now is strengthening a future codebreaker. And I don't have to tell you what the guild's policy on that is. That subject was one that Yvonne knew too well, perhaps even better than Wade. Useful power or not, if she seemed like a danger to the guild, then the threat would be neutralized. There was nothing else to say on the matter, so Yvonne politely changed the subject. You're sure she's all science? I've never met a full phase shifter without at least a little magic helping the process. Positive. It was an accident, so she's not certain how to recreate it. But the fact remains that Torai Rivas found a way to turn into sentient fire. The two men were standing in a small office not far from the training facility where Torai was going through her daily combat training. They weren't in the guild's proper headquarters. Aside from concerns about the length of her tenure, no one felt comfortable having people with powers test their limits in the same place where files and servers were stored. This was a training facility set up behind a secret door in what was, for the most part, a pork rendering plant. The smell alone was enough to keep all but the most determined of parties away. The power is impressive, sure, but with how she's using it, she'd never get above Delta class. Just having Arcanica switch to flaming skeletons would be enough to render her whole attack strategy useless. I told you that she had potential, not that she was ready to go. Wait reminded him, if she were already adept and skilled, then your to the lids wouldn't be necessary, I guess. Does she just have the fire shifting, or did she get anything else? She heals at a rapid rate. She even more so when given time to shift between phases. Her body is tougher than humans, though nothing approaching your level, and her basic speed and strength are augmented as well. What really shines through, however, is her intellect. The clothes she was wearing when the exercise started, the ones that phased with her, she made those herself, invented a process all on her own, with no funds or facility to speak of. The woman has a strong education, a bright mind, and a, forgive the phrase, burning ambition. Yvonne nodded and kept his eyes on the monitor. Creating fabric that could shift phases wasn't unheard of, but the rarity of needing it and complexity and making it meant that phasing outfits were very expensive. Like most metal tech, it was rare and hard to buy unless you were the one making it. That she'd managed to create some without any resources did speak to a smart mind, but not so brilliant of one that Yvonne understood his friends' interest in this woman. Be straight with me here. Wait, what's the deal? Is she the daughter of some guy in the guild who wants his kid in the business, or related to a cape that we're trying to stick it to by turning family, or something along those lines? She's got potential, I'll give you that, but I don't know that she has enough to warrant all the special treatment. What's the deal? Wade repeated, his eyes never darting away from the monitors. He lifted a long finger and pointed to the image on the screen. Orcanicus won't be able to keep pumping out skeletons for much longer. He's already beginning to sweat. Sure enough, the road man was red-faced as he continued weaving magic and conjuring animated bones from nothingness. I remember when he could curse a continent without so much as getting winded. Age is beginning to take him, as it will eventually take almost all of us. Wade shot his friend a targeted glance on the word almost, and Yvonne pretended not to notice. So what, you want a successor? Then you should train her. It's not about an individual successor. It's about the impact we leave on the next generation. Some of the new members are hungry for violence and blood. They went around to see how bad things can get when we make war with the capes. Even Balaam, though appointed to the guild's council, constantly tries to move for amendments that would allow our members more freedom for carnage. There are always a few who want to go back to the old ways. We have a system for codebreakers, Yvonne said. He didn't enjoy the system or his occasional role in it, but that didn't change the fact that it had to be there. But if enough like Balaam rise through the ranks, they can change the code, rewrite it, strip it of meaning, and destroy the tenuous peace we've been able to create. I want more in our ranks, like her concerned with freedom over violence, someone who embraces this life because they refuse to bow down. Instead of wanting to cut others to their knees, save it for the poetry slam. I get your point. Yvonne looked at Torai once more, watching her tear through the last of the skeletons in the room. You really think she can be someone we count on if she's taught properly? I know it, Wade said. Then I guess I should go meet her and see for myself. Tell Arcanicus to clear out. I'm administering her next test. I suspect he'll be overjoyed for the break, Wade replied. Dare I ask what this test will be? I'm going to see if she's got what it takes to learn under me, Yvonne said. He gently stretched his arms behind his back, noting the robe popping sounds from various joints. Fair warning though, either she passes her entrance exam, or it will probably kill her. That going to be an issue? No problem at all. Chapter 3. The metal doors whispered open, but this time it wasn't more pathetic skeletons tottering through. Dr. Machaniacal walked in, instead side by side with some guy who looked closer to Torai's age. She wondered if she'd have to fight this one too. She really hoped not. Combat wasn't why she'd agreed to this training. And besides, aside from being fit, the new guy didn't seem exceptionally powerful. Not the looks meant much when dealing with meta-humans. Yvonne noticed the appraising look she gave him and kept his own expression neutral. From her body language, she'd drawn all the wrong conclusions about him. That didn't particularly bother Yvonne. In fact, he took it as a compliment. He worked very hard to maintain his mundane facade. Her inability to see through it was just a testament to how effective it was. Of course, that wouldn't excuse the mistakes she was bound to make, but Yvonne felt complimented all the same. Doctor, she said, keeping her tone flat but respectful. I hope you're here to tell me I'm done fighting skeletons. Learning to deal with multiple opponents is an important aspect of training, Wade told her, though you could stand to work on your delicacy. If I'm fighting a room full of people, delicacy is going to be the last thing on my mind. That statement there sums up why you need to work on it, Yvonne said. Torai was a bit surprised at the authority in his voice. He spoke with the sort of confidence and power she associated with older, more established people. When you got a room full of people coming for you, that's exactly when you should be delicate, not explosive. Explosive seemed to work just fine. Torai gestured to the fading bits of bone in the room. Most had already turned back into the mystic ether from which they were sculpted, but a few fragments were still dotting the floor. And if you're in a room with allies, Yvonne asked, stepping over a fading chunk of skull. Arcanicus's constructs tended to stain if one stepped on them while they dissolved. And these were new shoes. I'm sorry, aren't you? All a bunch of villains. I didn't really think I'd need to learn about how to play on a team. Then you're even more foolish than I first suspected, Yvonne said. Of course we work together. The very existence of this guild should demonstrate that concept to you quite thoroughly. He turned to Wade, who was somehow managing to keep a cheerful grin fixed firmly in place. You're really sure about this woman? She has potential, Wade replied simply. She also has ears and doesn't like being talked about, as if she isn't in the room. Torai glared at both of them for a moment, then directed the bulk of her ire to Yvonne. Dr. Mechanical gets a pass out of respect for what he's accomplished, but I've got no inclination to take any shit off of you cockies. Actually, I'm the most important person in the world so far as you are concerned, Yvonne said, because I'm the one who decides if you live to see another sunrise or not. The guild is thinking about terminating your association with them, but Dr. Mechanical has persuaded them to let you stay on as an apprentice. Of course, any apprentice needs a teacher, and that's what he's trying to rope me into doing. You're full of it, Torai snapped. No, everything he said is perfectly true. Wade didn't even bother to look ashamed. To him, the situation was a purely practical one. There was no need to get caught up in sentiment over it. You must have realized your attitude and refusal to cooperate would have consequences. Many of my colleagues feel you can't be made useful and they advocate ending this experiment before you become too troublesome for the first time. Since Ivan had laid eyes on her, uncertainty flickered across Torai's face. Her eyes darted from him to Wade and back, to him, repeating this cycle several times before she found her words. Okay, maybe I haven't been a perfect little student, but it's not like I asked to join you guys in the first place. What do you ask for is irrelevant. You're here, this is the situation. Standard training is clearly a lost cause. You'll either leave this room as an apprentice or not at all. Wade said, then be my teacher. You're the one I want to learn from anyway. Please help me. Out here he's already convinced people who aren't easily swayed to give you another chance. I've been interrupted. Dr. Mechanical is the reason you ever got this opportunity at all, so be grateful for what he's done. But there are no buts. Ivan across the room and was now close enough to feel the heat radiating off his prospective student. Either she was upset or just pissed. Either way, she was unconsciously cranking up the temperature. If he took her as a student, her first lessons would be on control. I've been chosen to teach you. If I accept the job, then you get to prove Dr. Mechanism was right by not doing anything to make me have to kill you. Tori stared at him for a few moments, emotions flickering through her eyes. As she tried to make sense of a suddenly life-threatening situation, for the briefest of seconds, Ivan thought she would settle on panic or worse, fear. But she pulled herself together, and her eyes grew hard. She was letting anger carry her through this. It wasn't a bad call, provided she could keep it wrangled. Fine. So you're here to decide if I'm teachable, is that it then? What do I have to do to prove that I'm worth the effort? I can roast skeletons all day. If that's your cup of tea. Ivan shook his head. No, I don't think that will be necessary. All I want you to do is survive a single punch from me. That's your test. Torai tilted her head ever so slightly. Survive a punch, that's it. I guess I have to stay in human form. Then you can be fire if you want to. Ivan said, you could also try to dodge or avoid it. I'm only throwing the one punch, so if you succeed you pass. I'll even tell you where I'm hitting you. It's going to be dead center in your torso, right through your sternum. Is this for real? Torai looked over at Wade, who gave her a small nod. You know that when I'm in fire form, physical attacks can't hurt me. I have things to do today. Let's move this along. Ivan took a few steps back and cocked his right fist back. Take your time and get set. Let me know when you're ready. And that's when I'll punch. Torai wasn't sure what to make of this strange man with dark hair and seemingly unwarranted confidence. But she was smart enough to take an associate of Dr. Mechanismical seriously. Her skin grew warm, then red, and then vanished completely as her entire form shifted to that of animated flame. She retained a humanoid shape for the moment, giving him a torso to aim at. Meant his moves would be easier to anticipate. Her fiery feet slid back along the floor as Torai braced herself, prepared to move in a heartbeat, after taking a few seconds to make sure there was nothing else she could do. Torai realized she was stalling. It was now or never. Ready. Her voice sounded like a fireplace crackling with fresh logs, but the words were still enunciated perfectly. Her attention was on the curious man in the khakis. She was ready to react the instant he moved. It was this concentration that saved her life. In the sliver of an instant between, when Ivan closed the gap between them and slammed his fist into her torso, Torai sensed the slightest movement, acting on instinct more than strategy. She shifted a few millimeters back, turning his strike into a glancing blow instead of a direct one. She expected something strange to happen, for his hand to hurt when it went through her, or for him to display a burst of cold powers, which she hadn't counted on or imagined, not even for an instant, was that his fist would hit her as solidly as if she were still flesh and blood. She flew backward and crashed into the far wall. Her form was undone as soon as she struck, leaving her little more than a flaming puddle smeared against the steel wall. She was in more pain than she'd ever experienced in this form, but Torai was still conscious. That meant she was alive. How her voice crackled from the slowly reforming mass of fire. She was barely able to string words together. Ivan, to his credit, kept his word and didn't throw another attack. Instead, he just stared, watched her carefully through eyes that no longer belonged to Ivan the manager. These eyes were almost entirely black, aside from a series of runes burning from the center of each eye. Though the eyes didn't belong to Ivan the manager, they did belong to another identity of Ivan's, one he hadn't used for many years. Torai finished pulling herself together and shifted back to her human form. She was sweating, her chest hurt like hell, but she was alive as she pulled her head up and looked at the man who had so easily busted her. She was treated to her first look at those impossible, unnerving eyes. Holy shit, Torai yelled. Terror momentarily forgotten in the rush of confusion and excitement. You're fucking Fornax. You're supposed to be dead. Fornax is dead. He closed his lids for several seconds, and when he opened them up, his eyes were completely back to normal. My name is Ivan, but you can feel free to call me Mr. Gerhardt, teacher, or just plain sir. You have good instincts. You avoided the hit even when logic told you it wouldn't hurt. Let's see if we can develop those instincts into actual skills. Guess that means I passed. Torai slowly pulled herself to her feet. Neither man moved to help her, nor would she have accepted if they had. Lucky me. That remains to be seen. There may come times when you curse yourself for gliding, for not just dying when you had the chance. Ivan treated her to his best, consoling manager smile. I look forward to working with you, Torai. He turned and left the room, Dr. Mechanico a few steps behind. Only when they were gone did Torai allow herself to fall against the nearest wall. She didn't know how he'd managed to hit her like that, but it was hardly surprising. He was capable of it. Fornax was one of the original villains. He'd been as infamous as Dr. Mechanical in his own day. The man was as notorious as he was powerful, and he was renowned for being damn near unstoppable. All of which raised the pertinent question: how on earth had he managed to fake his own death and hide for so many years? She's green, driven by emotions, and thinks she's a lot stronger than she really is. Ivan didn't bother stopping as they stepped out of the car and entered the guild's actual headquarters. He knew all too well how keen Wade's senses were, or rather how keen the nanits in his blood made his senses. So you're saying she's you? Back when we were starting out, Wade kept pace as they headed down the halls, already certain of the destination, and Ivan's mind. Cute look. I said I'd do the job, and I will all teach her to the best of my ability. But if she steps too far out of bounds, the punishment for codebreakers is the same for every member of this guild, Wade said, from its most senior members to its newest apprentices. If she can't work within our boundaries, then you'll do what is necessary. How is it you can say that with so much detachment? But you were the beloved billionaire, and I'm still looked at as a monster. Ivan finally arrived at the door he was looking for and nearly barreled through it. On the other side was a medium-sized room with tables, plastic chairs, and vending machines serving up soda and microwavable fare. Ivan walked right over to the soda machine and pressed his thumb against a small touchscreen on the side. A barely visible panel in the wall slid away, revealing a set of ascending stairs, and both men began to climb. It's not like people know that Wade Wyatt is Dr. Mechanical. So far as the public is concerned, he's ancient history, and I'm the man who lets them listen to music on devices the size of their fingernail. Yeah, and Fornax has been dead since the Orion incident. I still feel like I get more hate than you do, and your persona isn't even confirmed to be dead. Ivan emerged at the top of the stairs. In a lush room with red carpet, there was an open bar, large tables with crisp white tablecloths, and an army of robot butlers ready to prepare any drink or delicacy one could imagine. You're just complaining to change the subject, Wade said. I know you were worried about having an apprentice. Damn right I'm worried, Ivan snapped. He flopped onto a cushy sofa and motioned for one of the nearest robots to come attend to him. How are we even going to work this? I can't stay in guild quarters. My neighbors will notice if I suddenly stop coming home, to say nothing of my kids every other week. And the robot made its way over to Ivan, and he promptly ordered 3 BLTs and a glass of sweet tea. Yet you seem to have no qualms about using the senior staff facilities. Wait noted. Hey asshole, you were the one who guilted me into taking a seat on the council. Executive break rooms are one of the fringe benefits, and I'm going to use it as well. You should I constructed them with you in mind. After all, from the grand dreams of our ideal layer we used to have back when we were squatting in abandoned warehouses. Don't you dare try to invoke the good old days with me. Ivan rubbed his temples with his index finger and thumb, despite the fact that there was no physical pain in his head. It had been years since he'd gone up against anything strong enough to actually hurt him. Let's just talk logistics. How am I going to train that woman? I guess I could come in on afternoons and some weekends if I move things around. That would make you her coach, not her teacher, Wade told him. You know perfectly well the way these things are done. She's going to move into your home, be under your tutelage, and care for as many hours in the day as possible. Hell's bells, Wade, my neighbors are going to have a field day if I suddenly have a 20-something-year-old female staying at my place. The Jensens alone would start putting me in the prayer requests at church, and Lord only knows how that gets the gossip fountain flowing. I have to live in that suburb, you know. The two were interrupted as the robot returned with sandwiches and sweet tea in hand. Ivan accepted the plate, greedily digging into the first BLT as Wade addressed his concern. I've already been working on a cover story. She's your cousin's daughter, going through a bit of trouble at home and staying with you until things are sorted out. Wade reached into his back pocket and produced a small tablet. He set it in front of Ivan, who ignored it as he continued to eat, and gestured at the blank screen, waiting to be unlocked. And that is her cover, false history, and all pertinent information you might need. It's all airtight. Every internet search they try will show Torai's history and bloodline to you. The movers currently setting up at your house are already chit-chatting with the neighbors and letting the pertinent details slip. Ivan finished chewing a bite and slowly lowered his sandwich, glaring at Wade as he did. Setting up at my house. You told me you accepted her apprenticeship. I took you your word and assumed you understood the duties. Where the hell is she supposed to sleep? I don't have any free bedrooms. The top of your garage is being retrofitted into an apartment. It won't be fancy, but she is in her apprenticeship. After all, frills come with accomplishments, of course. Indigo Technologies will cover the alterations and increased bills. You just think you're so damn smart, don't you? Ivan drummed his fingers soundlessly on the squishy cushion of the couch. There's a pretty big issue you skipped over though. What about my kids? I'll do a lot for this council for you, but there's no way I'm letting some half-cocked rookie anywhere near Rick and Beth. That's a deal breaker. Torai will have tutoring here on the weekends. Wade said though her cover will be that she's undergoing counseling at a special facility. You'll be expected to train her when time allows. But I knew when I asked you to do this that there would have to be some exceptions. Gee, you think? Ivan gulped down a few mouthfuls of the tea and grimaced. No matter how many times he had Wade tweak their programming, the robots just couldn't get sweet tea right. They made good sandwiches and coffee though. So that was something. I don't suppose I can use her as an excuse to skip council meetings, can I? Sadly no, Wade said. Like all apprentices, she'd be expected to tag along and learn at your side. Speaking of you, remember, we have one next Wednesday, right? Unfortunately, remember when being a villain was all about wild nights and brawls in the street? Yes. I also remember being confined in a cell under so much security I could scarcely move. Wade reminded him. I didn't say it was all perfect, but now I swear we do more meetings and slideshows than we do at my office job. Ivan shook his head. I wasn't built for this side of the business, yet you continue doing an impeccable job. Chin up. If nothing else, I imagine your new apprentice will add some of the old excitement back into your life. That's what I was thinking, and why I didn't want one in the first place. Ivan leaned back in the chair, lazily holding his second BLT. Honestly, a small part of me hopes I have to kill her. The other option is actually teaching her, which seems far more dangerous. I'm pretty fond of our world, but the last thing it needs is a disciple of Fornax. For an axe has been dead for over a decade, Wade said, crossing his slender hands in his lap. Tori will be a disciple of Ivan, nothing more, nothing less. Let's just hope that's not worse. Chapter 4. Torai watched the streets crawl by, marveling at how impressively identical each of the homes were. Certainly, there were minor variations in design or decoration, but it was abundantly clear that each of the houses had been constructed from the same central design. She'd been to places like this before, usually on a quick burglary run to scrounge up money for components, and every time it overwhelmed her with an indescribable sense of horror. How could these people be so content to spin about aimlessly like cogs in one of her earlier inventions? It boggled the mind. Even one as impressive as hers, the driver, a muscular man who had said nothing since she was led into his car that morning, turned left, bringing them into a different subdivision. It had taken a few days to get everything settled, but she was finally making the big move out to her new digs. She kept quiet about her dislike of the situation. The whole mess had apparently come about from how much she'd been dragging her heels in the first place. Plus, any place to stay was probably better than that pork processing plant she'd been kept in. It was nice not to be dead. And while she'd have much rather learn from Dr. Mechanical Fornax, wasn't a horrid consolation prize except that he wasn't Fornax. Dr. Mechanical had been adamant about that point. It was a name she was never to speak aloud to avoid thinking about. If at all possible, Fornax had to be dead for Ivan, her teacher. To have any sort of life failing his training might result in death. But spilling his big secret would result in the sorts of punishments she'd rather die than endure. The way Dr. Mechanical had so coldly explained what was waiting for her if she slipped up still sent a shiver down her spine. There was a slight bump as the SUV turned off the street and pulled into the open driveway. It was adjacent to another house, one that was just like all the others, completely indistinguishable in any way except that one of the world's most notorious villains lived there. Torai felt her opinion of these neighborhoods rise slightly. There was something to be said for camouflage that let one blend with the herd. Ivan stood on the porch waving with a careful smile. It was smart not appearing too happy about her arrival. After all, her cover story meant she was closer to a burden than a blessing. If he'd been overjoyed, that wouldn't have fit properly. Torai's opinion of Ivan was going up to the man clearly had practiced blending in, or she supposed he was just unhappy to see her and didn't mind letting it show through. With a grunt, Tori hauled her suitcase out of the bag. Everything she needed was already up in the prepared apartment. But it wouldn't do to have her arrive without baggage. Torai had the feeling this wasn't the first time Dr. Mechanical had orchestrated something like this. She doubted it was even within his first 100. Despite the early hour, several of Ivan's neighbors were out somewhere mowing their lawns, others trimming hedges, a few even tending to well-kept flower beds. But all of them were clearly outside for the same reason, to get a look at Ivan's new tenant. For the most fleeting of moments, Torai was tempted to greet her uncle with a kiss on the lips just to cause a stir. She resisted, because she realized the momentary humor wouldn't be worth the complications it would create, and because she suspected Ivan would just dodge if she tried. Years of being dead aside, he was a legend for a reason. Torai, Ivan greeted. As she drew near the porch, he reached down and took the suitcase from her, then pulled her in for a one-sided hug. It was as awkward as an actual embrace between distant family members, which sold the ruse well. Uncle Ivan, Torai replied, "Good to see you again. And you come on inside, let's get you settled in." Ivan opened his front door and held it for her as she stepped through the entrance. Tori's first thought was to marvel at how mundane the foyer and living room were. A few pieces of bric-a-brac, some pictures on the wall, and a reasonably sized television sitting across from a worn sofa. Comfortable and lived in the house, had the kind of homey aura she'd never seen a fake dwelling accurately replicate, which meant most likely that it wasn't a fake at all. This was where Ivan laid his head. A head that would be at the top of Cape's hunting lists if they knew it was still on his shoulders behind her. She heard the door shut as Ivan walked in and set her suitcase on the ground. Then came the sound of deadbolts being locked into place, followed by a few mumbled words that she couldn't quite make out. Magic. Probably no one, at least no one who talked to the public, entirely knew where Fornax drew his powers from. But they were obviously magical in origin. Torai turned around to see Ivan running his thumb along the seam between the door and the wall. Before he turned and faced her, "Want something to drink? I'd love a beer." Ivan nodded. "Fine. Just don't let the neighbors see you drinking anything. You're supposed to be here to get clean. Remember, I'll keep any drinking inside the walls with the blinds shut." Torai promised. "Do that and grab a seat." Ivan walked off into the kitchen and Tori slid into an overstuffed green chair that had probably belonged to Ivan. When he first got out on his own, she was surprised he managed to hold on to it this long. Usually bachelor decor was the first thing to go when a man settled down. Ivan might not be married at the moment, but he seems to put together to have lived so long as a bachelor. Ivan came back from the kitchen with a cold beer and a bright orange koozie and a glass of iced tea. He handed her the bottle, allowing her to see that the koozie was from the 6th annual Green Terrace Block Grill. Out. Torai twisted off the cap and kept her snickering to A minimum, I'm going to be honest with you, Torai, I've never had an apprentice before. The guild considers me to have a poor temperament for teaching, which is probably why they let Wade pitch me as your instructor to begin with. They think I'll kill you and save them the trouble. Ivan took a draw from his glass of tea, then took a seat on the arm of the couch directly across from Tori. I'm not telling you that to be mean, I'm just letting you know up front that I'll be making up a lot of this as I go along. I promise to teach you, and I will, but you might have to bear with me as I chart the course. So all of that said, let's start at the top priority for every guild member. Tell me what you've learned about the code. The code is the slang term for the villain's code of conduct, a document put together by the guild founders. At its creation, it serves the purpose of keeping the capes from getting too aggravated by or interested in our activities, making sure that we never escalate to an all-out war with the superheroes of the world. Torai took a celebratory sip of her beer, feeling very confident in the answer she'd given. Textbook accurate, but also overall worthless. Ivan said the code is about survival, pure and simple. Some of it is to keep the capes off our asses, sure, but just as much is there to keep us from killing each other. For example, do you know why any villain planning to rob a building has to clear it with the guild first to be sure it's not a high priority for any of the superheroes or government agencies? If we accidentally target one of their bases, it could bring down a lot of heat. Wrong, it's to make sure none of us or the capes have any friends or family in that location. If a villain acts without approval and accidentally kills some other villain's sister, now we've got the start of a blood feud that's going to leave us with lots of dead bodies and more capes up our asses. Then we know what to do with. Ivan told her, you said you'd also want to make sure not to kill a cape's family. How would you even know if they had any in the building? Their identities are secret. Ivan snorted, then tried to play it off as a cough. He kept reminding himself that Torai was new. She'd been working off the public perception of how things functioned her entire life. We know who pretty much every superhero is in their downtime. Between Wade's text, some well-placed spells, and cell phone cameras, it's nearly impossible not to figure out who someone is under their mask. Then shouldn't you be targeting their friends and family? I mean, I'm not saying killing is great or anything, but isn't that the whole point of taking hostages? And see, thinking like that is exactly why the code exists, to protect villains from themselves and from taking actions they haven't thought all the way through. Ivan swagged a deep gulp of his tea. Ever hear of a villain named Orbit Corp? Doesn't ring a bell, Tori admitted. Wouldn't expect it to. He was on the scene in the early days. Same as docking me, found out the secret identity of a small-time cape. And since there was no code or guild to stop him, Orbit Corp took the guy's family hostage. Things went south, and he wound up killing the whole lot. Wife and all 3 children. Know what happened next? I'm gonna take a wild swing and say the cape killed your friend. First off, he was a work acquaintance, not a friend. Secondly, you're right, but that was only the beginning. The guy went mad with grief, found Orbicorb and tortured him for weeks before finally putting him out of his misery. Then he went after every known associate of Orbicorb's down to the last toady and minion and killed them too. In the end, we had to form a team specifically to bring him down, and he took a few more of us with him before he went. The lesson here, my young apprentice, is that if you take on a person with powers and leave them with nothing to lose, you have just stuck yourself in a whole wet mess of shit. That's why we have rules about clearing locations with the guild. That's why we have the code. Got it? Code is super important. No breaky. Torai let herself show a half smile as she finished her beer. I think could be a little scary when he got serious. Even if she hadn't known about all the power he was concealing, his demeanor alone would have had her defenses up. The code is the most important part of the villain's guild. It's the entire reason we're able to have a guild at all. Not all of us are traditional criminals. Some of us just feel like we should be allowed more freedom with our powers than the law permits. At the end of the day, we're able to live together because we all follow the rules and keep our heads down. It's our constitution, our commandments, and our credo all rolled together. Ivan set his glass down and made sure he had Tori's eye for this next part, as it was likely the information most apt to keep her alive. And if you were wondering, the capes never get their hands on codebreakers. We keep our own house clean for villains. You sure do have a lot of rules, Torai said. She'd taken his meaning just fine, but she refused to back down. By saying something submissive, there are plenty of metas out there breaking the law and living however they choose. This frequently ends up with them dead or in jail. We might have rules, but we also have longer lifespans and the ability to go outside. I'd say it's a good trade-off. I'll admit that you guys do seem to have your act pretty well together. Torai shook the empty bottle in her hand. Another nope, you'll need your wits about you. Ivan replied, rising from the arm of the couch. Now that you understand the importance of the code, you're going to be learning it inside and out. I want you as familiar with that document as one of the founders who had to fight over what went into it. Oh, come on, I thought weekends were going to be battle training, Torai said, gliding out of her own seat. As well, the rest of them will be. But I've always thought that if I had a student, the first thing I would do is drill the code into their head until they said it in their sleep. This weekend and future weekday afternoons are going to be spent reviewing it until I'm satisfied. Then we'll move on to more practical discussions. Afternoons, does that mean I get the days to myself? Absolutely not, you get your evenings. And that's it, Ivan told her. We'll talk about your weekdays tomorrow once I finish up the details with Dr. Mechanical. Be sure though, you're going to be under constant observation. I can really feel the love in this apprenticeship already, Torai said. You are not dead, yet that's about as loving as the guild can get. Now let's get you a copy of the code to look over. Ivan walked over to his bookshelf, hands skimming across thick leather-bound books that Torai had initially assumed were just decoration, as he let his hand to dance along the spines. He nearly hit a small picture at the edge of one of the shelves. It was too far away to make out well, but Torai was pretty certain she saw 3 people and a beach within the photo. He stared at it for a long moment and then spoke. There's one more thing to discuss. Before we start, you'll figure this out soon enough anyway, so I might as well tell you now. I have 2 children that I get custody of every other weekend. You are never going to meet them, see them, or hear their voices. I understand that what we have here is not a completely voluntary arrangement, and I'm prepared to deal with the consequences of that. If you decide to try and kill me to escape from the guild, so be it. Ivan turned away from the bookshelf and stared at her. His normal eyes were gone, and in their place were the dark orbs with the blood-red symbols in the center. Torai found herself overcome with the urge to look away, but refused to let her neck turn or her eyes waver. Ivan was trying to scare her, and while it was working, she could still show him that she was able to stand her ground. I want to be very clear about this, apprentice. What we have is between you and me, no one else. If you try to harm my children, if you injure them in any way, mentally or physically, I'm going to kill you. Ivan's voice was as empty as the darkness behind the symbols in his eyes. I won't take any joy in it. I won't feel any glory from it, but I'll still do it. And as much as I might dislike it, I am still very good at killing people. Do we understand each other crystal clear? Good. Ivan turned back to the bookshelf and kept skimming the titles. Go ahead and lug your suitcase up to the garage apartment and make sure everything is in order. We'll start when you get back. Torai said nothing. She merely grabbed the suitcase and headed out the door, back into the world of sunshine and nosy neighbors. It was a sharp contrast to the half-lit living room filled with threats, intrigue, and one of the most powerful villains to have walked the earth. The apartment was surprisingly nice for having been constructed in only a few days. A bed took up most of the room, but there was also a small desk with a computer, a mini fridge already stocked with sodas, a microwave, and a work table. The last component was the most important one to Torai, and she knew Dr. Mechanical had put it in for her. Especially true, there were no high-tech tools to play with, nor would she be allowed to make anything too dangerous while in the civilian area. But the workbench represented a space to create. It was a show of respect, scientist to scientist, as she rested on her bed, a copy of the code lying next to her. Torai wondered when she would find time to begin a new project. Ivan had kept his word and drilled her relentlessly about the code all afternoon, quizzing her constantly with both technical details and hypothetical scenarios. It wasn't like the document was especially long or complicated. It was just important in a way that was clearly very vital to Ivan. Torai slid off the edge of her bed and padded over to her computer, jiggling the mouse to bring it out of sleep mode. With a few quick keystrokes, she brought up Forenx's Wikipedia page. There was a picture of him, blood-red mask concealing every inch of his face save for those dark eyes with the blood-red runes. He never had any sort of official costume usually. He just wore dark, sturdy clothing, only the mask, and the eyes were Constance, those, and the power. Scrolling down, she skimmed through his biography. Most of it was stuff that she already knew. His early career had started a few decades after the scientist would become Professor Quantum accidentally introduced new elements to the world and changed the fundamental laws of the universe. Fornax came on the scene after capes were already entrenched and were thought to be unstoppable. In his first outing, he took down 3 of them. One was so mentally scarred by the experience that they quit the job altogether. When the press saw his eyes and the red glow that emanated from his limbs, some reporter compared his destruction to that of a black hole and named him after one of the few that wasn't just numbers and letters. Fornax. Only later on would smarter minds point out that this was the name of an actual galaxy, but by that point the name had already stuck. The early section covered his damage and criminal patterns thoroughly. Torai noticed that most of Fornax's big crimes were assault. He seemed to love fighting, especially capes. It was hard to reconcile someone like that with the controlled man who spent the day lecturing her. Ivan seemed not weak certainly, but measured. It was hard to imagine him going on a rampage like Fornax was known to do up until he was beaten anyway. Tori scanned the entry until she came to the section detailing Fornax's defeat. Lots of capes had gone up against him, but it had taken the girl with the golden glow to actually bring him down. Lodestar, considered by most to be the most powerful metahuman in known history, she'd met Fornax one-on-one and brought him down. Granted, the fight had destroyed half a rock quarry and taken 3 hours, but she'd done it. The only section after Fornax's defeat was about his death. Temporarily freed from prison, he'd been recruited to help deal with Orion when the mad metahuman tried to turn the Earth into an actual black hole. A coalition of capes and villains had worked together and managed to bring Orion down, but only barely. The criminals who survived were supposedly given reduced sentences, though many were also supposedly lost in the fight. Fornax had been among those listed as killed, and Dr. Mechaniacal was suspected dead as well. Torai tapped her finger on the desk cause she read more about the incident and scoured the list of names. If Fornax wasn't really dead, there was no guarantee that any of the others were either. But why lie about it? She had a suspicion, the hunch that made her worry. She was beginning to think like a paranoid kook. Then again, she reasoned she was already a member of a secret organization composed entirely of criminals. Perhaps a little paranoia was in order. After all, either way, she intended to get to the bottom of this little mystery. Fortunately, she didn't have to speculate. She could get the information right from the source. After all, Ivan was supposed to be teaching her Chapter 5. It's called the Orion Protocol for obvious reasons. Ivan told her as they ate breakfast the next morning. Torai had expected him to be kilogram or try and lie his way out of it, but Ivan hadn't even seemed surprised by her question. It made sense. He had to know the topic would be coming up sooner or later. Originally, there wasn't a name for it. There really wasn't even in it to name. I've been continued. There was just a lot of panicking people desperate for any solution they could find. Since you are bringing this up, I trust you already know about Orion. Torai nodded as she spread butter on a pancake. Former scientist to work with dark matter turned himself into some sort of living black hole. He's estimated to be one of the most powerful matters who has ever lived. Even that's an understatement. Ivan said Orion was terrifying in every sense of the word. Every scrap of humanity he had was burned away in his transformation. Fighting him was like going up against an act of nature. In all my years, I've only ever seen two other matters that might be on his level in terms of destructive potential. So when he made it clear that he was seriously trying to destroy the world, and then started to actually do it, a lot of influential people got very scared enough to where they were willing to throw anything they could at him, including former criminals. Tori had finished the buttering and had moved on to adding more syrup than was either necessary or healthy. Precisely. DOC and I were crooks and sort of jerks at the time, but we weren't sociopaths. Neither were most of the others locked up with us. We were just young, impulsive, and too weak to resist the temptation our strength offered. We were bad, but we didn't want to see the world destroyed. After all, we had to live here. To Orion put our crimes in perspective, and within a day of him destroying Detroit, We were getting pitched an offer we couldn't refuse. Ivan paused, rising from the table to refresh his coffee as well as get the jelly from the fridge. When he returned, he spooned a generous dollop of the purple glob onto his toast and then continued, "Actually, that's not true. Many of us did refuse it. Not everyone had a life sentence. And even on the inside, we knew going up against Orion was probably suicide. Those of us willing to roll the dice, however, were offered a full pardon in exchange for bringing him down. Obviously, we succeeded, and the government kept their end of the deal. Most of us were too notorious to actually be released. So our deaths were faked, and we were handed enough means to restart our lives as civilians, albeit with the caveat that one step over the line would land us back in a supermax. Hang on, if this was a one-time deal, then why have a name for the protocol? Torai asked. Smart question. Ivan said Orion was a threat to the entire world. But he wasn't the last one. Usually there's a real risk of Armageddon once a decade or so. When those come, the Orion protocol gets activated. Not every criminal gets the offer. Those who revel in slaughter or death are kept rightly where they should be. But the ones who are just greedy or dumb or gotten over their heads, they get a second chance, die fighting or live as a civilian. Luckily, the survivors aren't totally on their own anymore now. When they get out, the guild is there to help them adjust to the new world and keep them on the right path. These people just got out of jail, and you and your goons put them right back into a life of crime. That seems terrible from a moral and logistical standpoint. How do you even keep any members? Torai had demolished half of her pancakes already and was reaching for more syrup. Ivan noted this. Also taking her lean figure into the equation, he'd have to get her checked out to see if using her fire form burned excessive calories. If so, they'd need adequate nutritional supplies on hand for training. Officially, the guild is a rehabilitative facility run by former criminals to help others readjust and prevent younger ones from going down the wrong path in the first place. Ivan told her we're actually registered as a non-profit. And honestly, a lot of that is true. We do help other villains get back on their feet, and if they want out of the life, then it's our job to help them stay clean. However, for those who can never content themselves with trudging about like a normal person, while knowing that they could soar among the skies, we offer different services. Our people work smart, work safe, and keep from getting busted. You'd be surprised how much of what we do is technically illegal, assuming you have good lawyers and a loose sense of morality. I have to call bullshit here. Tori interrupted. The Capes would never let that happen. They're all about no compromise and keeping the world safe. If you really formed an evil league of wickedness out in the open, they would totally come busting down your doors. It's been tried by a few whose reach exceeded their grasp, but most of the older superheroes tolerate us. Out of necessity, we minimize civilian injuries, we keep our activities out of the public eye, and most importantly, we maintain order. The Capes get to be adored and loved by the entire world, so in sponsorship deals and pull kittens from trees. Meanwhile, we make sure the really terrible villains never see the light of day. We are on top, and we're not nice about how we stay there. Ivan sipped his coffee calmly, as though discussing casual murder was a regular breakfast activity. Some do still dislike us, there's no fighting that, but those in charge recognize the mutual benefits of our situation. They've seen what a world without the guild looked like when it was constant war between us and them. No one wins in that situation. Not us, not the Capes, and certainly not the regular people just trying to get through life. The devil you know, Torai muttered, polishing off the last of her pancakes. She chewed slowly, savoring the sweet flavor, while also contemplating what Ivan was telling her. The world was supposed to be cut and dry. The Capes flew around keeping the peace, putting down all who stepped out of line. Now it turned out that they not only tolerated the presence of evil, but also might depend on it. The situation, like most, was more complex from within than one could guess from the outside. Complex wasn't always bad, though. In fact, if one was quick, ambitious, and a bit morally flexible, complex could be quite lucrative. By the way, don't go depending on using the Orion protocol to get a free pass on whatever crimes you commit, Ivan cautioned her. We are quite adept at snuffing out the true world enders before they rise to high, so such incidents are few and far between. Besides, you were fortunate enough to get recruited to the guild before being incarcerated. That means that if you do the sort of thing that would get you seriously locked up, the capes will never have a chance to find you." Torai nodded. She was beginning to see why Ivan held the code so dear. It was a mutual shield keeping them safe from the superheroes, as well as keeping most of the world safe from villains who reveled in senseless destruction. Order was profitable, chaos less so. Still, she was amazed that they'd managed to get so many criminals to go along with it. Torai would have imagined that many were too stubborn or prideful to accept the wisdom of restraint, and Torai's instincts as usual were spot on. Even if she didn't yet know it, there can be no doubt a confluence is coming. The woman speaking was hunched over a crystal ball on a polished wooden conference table, her face illuminated by the soft purple glow emanating from its smooth, glassy surface. She made no gestures or incantation. Her focus was solely on what lay in the swirling depths of the ball. The light cast itself on the nearby wall, clashing with the robin's egg blue paint that had been chosen for its soothing properties. Across the room, a woman made entirely of metal and circuitry gave a slight nod that aligns with what our data models are suggesting. Skranthus, can you discern any idea of when the confluence will occur? Don't press her too hard, a young man cautioned. He sat next to Skranthos, the woman reading the orb, and wore a white-toothed smile as he watched her plumb the ball's depths. Though he was currently out of costume, he favored the same color scheme in his daily attire on this occasion. He was wearing a dark suit with a red shirt and a black tie. Aside from his irises, which were stained a dark maroon, he could have easily passed for a somewhat pretentious but otherwise normal human being. I just asked her to try. The metal woman responded. There's no harm in that. I've got half of my people trying to pin down when they think it will strike. Oh, care to make a wage on whose department gets it right. They long enough. Zealous is merely trying to collect all the information she can. Since we're dealing with a confluence, I'd trust you to appreciate how important this is for the guild at least. This voice belonged to a woman older than any of the others looked, though she seemed at most to be in her late 30s. Her raven black hair fell to her shoulders where it landed atop a tasteful blouse that paired well with her slacks. Unlike Balaam and Desirus's, there was nothing that marked her as visibly inhuman, which was just the way she liked it. My apologies, Morgana. The young man Balaam turned to Skranthos and gently rested his hand on her shoulder. If you would, my dear, I think we would all greatly appreciate any details you can offer. It is hard to discern, she said. Her eyes were glazed over as her head tilted slightly, straining to divine the unknowable. But the clouds gather on the horizon. I can feel the pulse of the ley lines as they brim with power. Such a state cannot be maintained. It must come soon, by the new moon's rise at the latest. Zealous's digital eyes flickered for a nanosecond as she checked a file on her hard drive. The next new moon is on Thursday the 17th. That means we're looking at a week and a half, assuming Skranthos is right. I'll ask my people to reconcile the prediction with their own models to be certain. Double check all you like, Balaam told her. Skranthos is the top diviner among all of our mystics. If she says it will come by the new moon, then that's what will happen. I do not doubt her skill, but a deadline and a date are not the same thing. Zella shot back, narrowing it down to a single day would greatly aid us in putting people in position. Double check, Morgana instructed. She loathed Wade for making her head up this committee. Zealous was enjoyable if strange, but Balaam could be an unapologetic ass when he felt like it, which was often. Still, no one could question that. The two of them certainly produced results. Morgana remembered a time when they got almost no warning at all of confluences, and then suddenly they were hip deep in metahumans. This was better, aggravating, but better. And Zealous, Morgana added, send a message to the other council members. Tell them we're having a mandatory planning meeting on Tuesday. Even if we don't have an exact date, I want all hands on deck for this shitshow once breakfast was done. Torai's education in the code resumed. It was still tedious and mind-numbing stuff, but she took to it with a touch more enthusiasm than she had on the previous day. Now that she understood the reason behind its existence, there was a desire to become familiar with it. It didn't make the morning any more fun. However, it did allow her to see the time of something other than a waste. Not long after they broke for lunch, Ivan's cell phone began playing a swelling piece of classical music that Torai recognized but couldn't place. He scooped it up and exited the living room, leaving Torai to study on her own. What she'd assumed would be a 5-minute call dragged on as Ivan's muffled voice drifted in snippets from the kitchen. The conversation took no less than an hour, and when Ivan returned he looked weary. The older man carefully lowered himself onto the couch, then glanced over at Torai. "You're smart with technical stuff, right? I built my own go-kart out of discarded parts. Before the age of 5, yeah, I've got an act," Torai replied, bristling slightly. "So you know how to work spreadsheets and databases?" Torai looked up at her teacher, slowly lowering the document she'd been rereading for at least the 10th time. "I think I'd like to know why you're asking that before I answer the question." "Because," Ivan said, letting out the word like a heavy sigh, "as of tomorrow morning at 8, you are officially my company's newest intern, and my personal assistant, answering phones, writing emails, minor scheduling, data processing, things of that nature." "I beg your damn pardon." Torai's eyes narrowed, and the temperature around her rose by 10 degrees. "Listen, I get that you all run on some archaic practices with the whole master and apprentice thing, and I'm on board with that. But if you think you can drag me around as your pretty little secretary, just because, Torai, you have a high school diploma, a few college credits, and 0 recent work history," Ivan said, cutting her off. "I don't even want to know what kind of strings we'd had to pull in order to get you this position. But I assure you, it has nothing to do with your looks or gender." Ivan rubbed his temples carefully, idly wondering if he'd been that quick-tempered at her age. The answer was of course yes, but it didn't make dealing with her now any easier. "You need to learn how to blend in with normal society. And to be frank, I don't trust you enough to leave you on your own. So Wade arranged for you to be my assistant. And what is it that you do anyway?" Torai asked. She wanted to steer the topic away from her work history, and plus she could only imagine what sort of position the man who had once held an entire state in terror commanded. "Project management and coordination for a software company." Ivan gave a half-hearted shrug, as if to say that yes, he knew how boring it sounded, and he didn't have any way to jazz the position up. "I oversee a few departments to make sure products are on schedule and error-free." Sounds responsible. Torai couldn't think of anything else to say that wouldn't sound derisive, and only barely managed to bite back a snicker. "It's a safe, simple, uneventful job, which is precisely why I have it," Ivan told her. "For one thing, I have a family to support. The pay is both fair and steady. For another, working a job like mine makes me seem like a responsible member of society. It lends credence to the charade that I'm not actually a member of a guild of villains nor a famous former criminal." Torai closed the book in her hand, leaning forward into the more interesting conversation. "What you said, the Capes already knew. You were all full of it." "They do. But my neighbors, friends, co-workers, and children all have no idea." Ivan said, "You're going to want some normality in your world, whether now or in 20 years. It's nice to talk with people about things other than how to loot a bank vault, and if you ever have a family, you won't ever want your children to look at you with the full knowledge of all the things you've done. I'm helping you lay the foundation so that you'll have a civilian identity when the time for it comes." "A civilian identity? I don't even have a villain identity," Torai pointed out. "Sure you do. It's all you have." Ivan stretched out his hand and gestured to Torai, gliding his arm in a circle. "All of this is your villain identity. The woman who dropped out of college and joined a gang, who got along by pulling smash and grabs to fund her scientific pursuits, who was nabbed by Dr. Mechaniacal and put into training tomorrow. Your civilian life starts again. You become Torai, the lady who hit a rough patch, but got a lucky break on an internship, and who might be able to work her way into a steady job. She's the identity you'll need to cultivate to protect." Torai rose from the chair, walking over to the bookshelf and setting Ivan's copy of the code amid the other tomes. She lingered for a moment, noting the various pictures of him throughout the years: young Ivan and a pretty woman in a restaurant, Ivan fishing with several other men, Ivan and his children at a picnic. It was strange to see the man she'd read about last night, whose name was whispered like that of a legend or god in such mundane circumstances. What was even odder was that Ivan looked so natural in them. This middle management family man struck her as the true version of Ivan. It seemed impossible that he could actually be Fornax, which Torai realized was exactly what Ivan wanted and what he was trying to teach her how to do. "If Torai is my civilian self, does that mean villain me needs a coding name?" Eventually Ivan said, "For now, apprentice will do just fine." Chapter 6. Torai wasn't sure how she felt about the pantsuit. Granted, the dark color paired well with her blue shirt, and the whole outfit wore quite well on her. Dr. Mechanical had clearly had it tailored. But the overall look wasn't the issue at stake. What bothered Torai was how the suit made her feel. It was like she was wearing a symbol of selling out, of giving up on her dreams of success and independence. She was going to work a shitty temp job, the very fate she'd bucked against. By trying to make her own way in the world, this suit was mundaneous made physical, and it made her skin crawl when she thought about it for too long. All that made the act of wearing it bearable was the knowledge that it was an act, a costume, to protect her true identity. This was her mask, this was the facade that would keep her safe. If the strategy could work for someone like Fornax, then surely it could be effective for her. Besides, it wasn't like she had any choice in the matter. With one last glance in her mirror, Torai stepped out of the bathroom and left her garage apartment on a course for the main house. Ivan had made it clear that tardiness was completely unacceptable. She wasn't sure that she'd keep healing to his orders, but the relationship was a bit too fresh to push the boundaries already. Promptness wasn't an excessive demand anyway, especially since she was supposed to be catching a ride with the boss. Ivan was waiting when she entered the house, a crisp suit, white shirt, and crimson tie adorning his body. He handed her a bagel and a napkin. Before they'd even exchanged greetings, "Eat in the car, we need to get to HR in time to fill out your extra paperwork." Torai cocked an eyebrow even as she accepted the breakfast and followed him out the front door. "I thought all of that was taken care of. All the things that could be handled by others were," Ivan explained. He got into his car, checking his mirrors and buckling his seatbelt. Tori slid into the passenger seat and waited for the ride to start. Instead, she found Ivan staring at her, an impatient, pinched expression on his face. "What? I'm waiting for you to buckle your seatbelt. Seriously, you know I turn into fire reactively. When something hits me right, a car crash won't do jack." Ivan drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, but made no other motion to begin the drive. After a few moments of meeting his gaze, Torai reached up, grabbed the belt, and pushed it into its holder. Happy, ecstatic, Ivan turned the keys and pulled out of his driveway. "As I was saying, the forms that could be done were, however, due to our special circumstances, we have to go in personally to fill out extra forms with HR." "Is this a guild thing?" Torai asked, her question through a mouth muffled by a big bite of bagel. "This is a corporate thing. Since you and I are ostensibly family, you are hiring would constitute nepotism if I were the one to orchestrate it. Even working together has the potential to be misconstrued. That's why we'll be signing documents allowing the company to intervene if there are complaints about the quality of your work and me not keeping you on task." "Almost sounds like working under you puts a target on my back," Tori noted. Ivan nodded. "In a way it does. You'll have to work harder to prove yourself than someone else in your position would go above and beyond to show that you deserve to be there." Torai finished off the last of her bagel, then brushed the crumbs off her pants. Ivan didn't wince as he saw them tumble to the floor of his well-maintained car, but only barely. "So not only do I have to work a day job, I have to do it while people are muttering shit about me behind my back. Gee, thanks again for getting me this swell position, teacher. I'm not thrilled about this either, but it was the only way to explain your residence at my home and our daily carpooling. If we tried to hide the connection that Dr. Mechanical established, it would have raised people's suspicions. That is the very opposite of what we are attempting to do." "I've been paused at a light in motion for another car merging illegally to go ahead. Yeah, I've been wanting to talk to you about that," Torai said. "While I appreciate how much you all have done for me, I would like to make a return trip to my place at some point. There's some tech I'd like to recover along with my clothes and my motorcycle. Your place has already been emptied out and your possessions cataloged," Ivan replied, twisting the wheel to turn them down an arrow street. "What? But how? Standard protocol for new members. Everything that you've stolen and could be traced back to you, including your motorcycle, was either dumped or destroyed. The rest is put away safely into storage for when you can earn a place of your own. Individual items can be removed by filling out request forms, though they don't often make exceptions for trainees. You aren't supposed to be that comfortable after all." Tori turned and looked out the window, watching the gray office buildings roll by as they entered the eastern part Of downtown, they were so bland and boring, like a corporate version of Yvonne's neighborhood. Soon she would be one of the suit-wearing dots. Filtering through these places, a wave of nausea tried to rise up in her stomach again. But Torai forced it down. She had been through so much worse than this, and the opportunity in front of her wasn't one she felt inclined to let go of. Torai Revis could smile and nod as needed, so long as she spent the rest of her time forging the new life being offered to her. There's a picture of me with both my parents. We're at a park, and it's in a faded gold frame. Any chance they let me have it? Ordinarily, probably not. Yvonne said he drove slowly through the security gate, nodding at the guard on duty, while a camera scanned the sticker in his windshield, and then pulled into his assigned parking space. But I've got a little bit of clout around the guild. Do your best today, and I'll see what I can manage. Torai nodded. She'd never expected her request to be fulfilled for free. That wasn't the sort of relationship she and Yvonne had. In a way, though, it was comforting. She knew the stakes with him. There was no subterfuge or trickery. It was all there out in the open, which made dealing with him far simpler than with most criminals. With one last glance out the window, Torai unbuckled her seatbelt and left the car. The dull brown building loomed before her. As a river of peons trickled into its glassy mouth of a door, Yvonne began gliding forward, and she followed suit. It was her turn to be devoured by this place, and she had to do all she could to make sure it didn't spit her back out. The Alliance of Heroic Champions didn't have a council, or at least didn't call what they had a council, because councils, according to their PR department, tended to conjure up negative imagery associated with shadowy ruling criminals. Instead, they referred to their oversight committee as the Champions Congress. Unlike in the Villains Guild, those on the Congress were not selected by the various groups as representatives. Instead, the three who sat on it were either founding members or appointees, who had been chosen by exiting members and ratified by the other two. At least that's how the replacement system would work in theory, since none of the original three had formally renounced their positions. Yet it was still an untested method. Fortunately for all involved, the Champions Congress was only needed for major changes or decisions. The lesser tasks of running the EHC were appropriated to various subcommittees, which held elections every 2 years. On the same day that Torai was going in for her first day of work, the head of the new acquisition subcommittee was walking down a well-lit hallway with a thick folder under his muscular arm. Apollo wore no sleeves. He favored a sleeveless golden breastplate that paired with his armored kilt and sandals. They show nearly as brightly as the blonde curly locks atop his head, a wonderful accentuation to his blue eyes and perfect smile. There was a reason he had been chosen to head the new acquisition subcommittee for 3 elections in a row. The man knew how to turn on the charm when courting unsigned metahumans. He walked carefully up the hallway, enjoying the sunshine beaming through the clear windows. The AHC's base occupied a large block of drab city streets, but the sprawling compound was outfitted with artificial terrains to fit all walks of life, even those not originating from Earth. For Apollo, all he needed was the sun, the shard of divinity he'd inadvertently taken from his namesake. The sun god of legend reacted each time the light hit him. He felt suffused with power and strength, as though he were truly invincible. Apollo had been on the job long enough to know this wasn't the case, but he still enjoyed the feeling nonetheless. As he arrived at his destination, Apollo gave 3 crisp knocks against the wooden door before him. It was unassuming, impossible to differentiate from any of the other offices throughout this floor, because the man inside simply refused to see his position as something that elevated him above the others. While the other 2 members of the Champions Congress liked to work remotely or in private quarters, when they actually came to base, Horn viewed himself as one of the people. Well, perhaps not as one of them, but certainly not as being any better. Come in. The voice from behind the door was firm but friendly. Apollo opened the door to find Quorum typing on his computer. He wore a simple collared shirt and jeans, his usual attire when not functioning in an official capacity, and motioned for Apollo to have a seat. "Good morning, sir," Apollo said as he carefully settled into one of the gray chairs with which Quorum meant all the others had stocked their offices. "Good morning to you, Apollo." Quorum looked at the younger superhero with a warm smile, while his left hand continued typing away. The computer multitasking was just one of his many talents. "What brings you by this morning?" We've gotten wind of a confluence. Apollo set the folder on Quorum's desk. Quorum pulled the folder over and flipped it open with his free hand. All magical, astrological, and technological signs point to one striking within the next week or so, Quorum said, quickly interpreting the data before him. If you don't mind, I'll hang on to this and see if I can't narrow down the window a bit. Of course, sir, we have plenty of copies already. That one is for you. Excellent. I'll alert Lodestar and Professor Quantum about this. But I trust you are already putting procedures in place. Quorum said. He continued to look at the folder's pages while his hand clacked away at the keyboard. This multi-pronged focus was disconcerting to watch at first, but over time everyone more or less got used to it. We are doubling down on patrols for the next 2 weeks, as well as putting key people in every hospital, police station, and public area. When the new meadows pop up, we'll be there to shake their hand, tell them it's going to be okay, and offer them an application. Wonderful work as always, Quorum said. You're really going all out to prove how much you want that seat. It's just me doing my duty, Apollo said, working as hard as he could to keep his voice humble, though only marginally succeeding. Please keep it up. Trust me when I say your efforts are not going unnoticed. Quorum flipped through a few more of the pages on his desk. Also, let's call a meeting for this afternoon. By then I may have gotten a better idea of when the confluence will strike. The more precise a time frame we have, the better a chance we're given to help the people dealing with such confusing new circumstances. Couldn't have said it better myself, sir, Apollo replied. That was true whether he meant it to be or not. Apollo wouldn't have been able to keep himself from adding a snide comment to the tail end of the statement. However, Quorum might be after these new metas out of pure altruism, but there were many others in the AHC who had different motives, most important among them getting to the new metas before that damn villains guild. This is your cubicle, Ivan told Torai, gesturing to the small desk with gray felt walls running along the sides which separated it from the identical desks on either side. There are many like it, but this one is yours. Does that usually get a laugh? Torai asked. She sat down the stack of papers that HR given her, idly noting that all her cube came with was a computer and a filing cabinet. You'd be surprised some people around here think of me as the office cut up. Ivan's face was stoic as always. His tone is flat as a forgotten soda. I'll leave you here to get settled in and started on your paperwork, which HR needs to have from you by lunch. After that, we'll have a quick meeting about what your daily schedule should be for this first week as you get your feet wet. Torai ogled the stack of papers before her eyes going wide at how much reading and signature scrolling she'd have to do in order to have it complete by lunchtime. And what are you going to be doing? While I work on all this, my job obviously. Tori extended his arm and checked his watch, making a small clucking sound with his tongue. When he saw the time, I'm already 5 minutes late for a morning meeting. In fact, I'll swing by here at 11 sharp to take you to drop off your paperwork and show you where the cafeteria is. Please be ready by then. Without another word, Ivan was heading down the dull carpet under the fluorescent lights towards some meeting that Torai imagined would make her brain try to eat its way out from the inside. If she had to sit through it, then she looked at the stack of papers on her desk again, and suddenly an escaping toothy brain didn't seem like such a terrible scenario. Hey there, said a new voice from beside her. Torai leaned back to find herself looking at a young man roughly around her age with oversized glasses and a shock of bright red hair. You must be the new administrative assistant. I'm Donald, part of the programming department. He offered his hand, which Tori accepted and shook. Torai Rivas, it's nice to meet you, Donald. You too, he replied. And don't worry too much about Mr. Gerhardt. He seems scary, but as long as you get your work done, he's actually really nice. I'll keep that in mind, Torai said, giving her cubicle mate a professional smile. After a few moments of debate, she decided that since they'd gone to all the trouble of creating and telling HR her backstory, she should probably at least try to sell it a bit. Actually, I already know Mr. Gerhardt pretty well. He's my father's second cousin. They've always been so close that he was like an uncle to me. Donald's already wide eyes grew several sizes larger as he took in the news. Oh wow, no wonder you got such a large starter stack for me, Jar. Yeah, I got here on my own, but then was put in his department, so you know rules are rules. Torai patted the stack of documents, which she could swear was growing every time she looked away, just for added emphasis. I wouldn't worry about It too much, Donald told her. Mr. Gerhardt has a reputation for being fair. I can't imagine anyone will accuse him of giving you special treatment, unless he actually does. Donald's pale skin grew suddenly flushed, especially the tips of his freckled ears. Wait, sorry, I didn't mean to say that. Don't worry, I got what you meant, Tori assured him. After weeks of dealing with the guild and years of being around crooks, she found it oddly endearing to see someone so worried about hurting her feelings. And trust me, Uncle Ivan isn't going to take it easy on me. If anything, I'm on thinner ice than anyone here. In that case, maybe I should leave you alone, so you can knock out all that HR paperwork. Donald glanced at the massive stack of papers on her desk. Even with his years of corporate drudgery, he couldn't help but blanch at the sight. Sadly, I think you're right. Tori started to turn back to her desk, but then paused, much as it pained her to admit it. She barely understood half the lingo thrown about in the HR meeting. If all the papers demanded was a series of signatures, then she would be fine. But some of the pages seemed to have a lot of blanks, the sort she would be expected to put more than a name in. Much as she enjoyed being independently capable, Tori was not so prideful that she couldn't see the benefit in receiving help when stuck in an unfamiliar land. Besides, if Ivan had put her in a situation where she'd be facing unfriendly forces, it was best to accrue allies as quickly as possible. Hey, Donald, this is my first time working for such an organized company. If I hit anything in this stack that I need clarification on, would you mind if I ask you for help? Not at all, Donald said, a sheepish grin stretching across his face. After all, we grunts have to look out for each other. Tori wasn't sure how she felt about the grunt classification, but Donald's sentiment was exactly what she'd been hoping for. With a little luck, a bit of guidance, and all of her wit, Tori felt like she might just be able to fake it through a whole day of her charade. Ivan had just made it into his office when he saw the shadow in the corner of the room. His eyes narrowed, and he readied himself for an attack. As a member in good standing at the guild and one of the 7 counselors, at that there was no official reason he would have to fear being jumped. But when one dealt with villains, it was always best to assume a power grab or unexpected grudge could lead to assassination attempts at any given time. It had happened before, though. The poor bastards that had come to Ivan's house that night had learned how little patience he had for his sleep being interrupted. Counselor, the shadow said, speaking in a whisper that Ivan instantly knew would be inaudible to anyone besides him, I come to tell you that a meeting has been called for tomorrow night. It is high priority, and all 7 must be in attendance as per the code's agreements. With still watchful eyes, Ivan gave a small nod, and the shadow vanished. Canicus must have sent it. He was one of only 3 people in the guild who officially knew Ivan's identity. After a couple of coup attempts, Ivan had made certain that his civilian name stayed off all records, and had Wade scramble any digital footage of him. When he entered the guild hall, he wore a mask at meetings and always used his official code name when dealing with most of the others, all to make it more difficult to find out who he was. None of this would stop the truly determined, of course, but it made it more difficult sometimes. That was enough of a deterrent in itself, especially since he represented the segment of the guild least likely to care about an attempt to grab power of the 7 guild sections. Ivan Gerhardt was the chosen representative of those who were non-active members, the retired villains, as most called them, or the whip dogs, as some of his more asshole-ish colleagues liked to say. Ivan went to his desk and grabbed some papers for the morning meeting. Mysterious messages and foreboding warning aside, he still had work to get done. Besides, if they were calling it a high priority, but not an emergency, then things probably weren't that bad. He hoped. Chapter 7. Please tell me I'm not just going to be doing that all the time, Tori said as they walked through the front door of Ivan's house, because if so, you may as well go ahead and let the guild know that they can kill me. I'll take a quick death over God knows how many years of sitting in that place when you become a full member. We can find a cover job that suits your style better, Ivan said, following her in and locking the door. As always, he ran his hand down the scene between the door and the frame, muttering words that Tori could barely make out and had zero comprehension of. Maybe something in the technological sector. I'm sure they can find space for you at Indigo Technologies. Ivan, Tori said, her voice suddenly filled with uncertainty. Rather than annoyance, I think you should see this turning around slowly. It did no good to show fear to a potential adversary. Ivan's eyes followed Torai's gaze to the coffee table where a large box with a bow rested in the center. It was done in a silver and black style that Ivan instantly recognized as Dr. Mechanical's. Still, he approached the package, slowly motioning for Torai to stay back, looking like something his friend had left him. And being something his friend had left him were two entirely different things. Ivan delicately lifted the top off the box and then let out a sigh of relief. "It's fine," he said. "They just dropped off your outfit for tomorrow night." "Am I going to the ball?" Torai moved forward slowly, trying to get a better look at what lay inside the mysterious box. "No, but I think this will suit you far more than some empty-headed gala ever would." Ivan reached in and pulled out a swatch of long dark fabric trimmed with a fiery red color along the seams and edges. "This is your apprentice's outfit, and it's what you'll wear at all times when we're on guild business." He handed the box to Torai, who began pulling out the various components: shirt, boots, pants, cloak, mask, toilet, each piece on the ground. As she extracted it, assembling the whole outfit on Ivan's carpeted floor, sort of generic looking. "It's an apprentice's outfit," Ivan reiterated. "It's meant to be generic. Full guild members get to design their own uniforms. But until you graduate to that level, you'll be left to blend in with every other apprentice out there. We do this partly to remind you of your place, but it also helps from a training perspective by keeping the costumes neutral. It makes it hard to tie any crimes you might commit in your apprenticeship to the identity you ultimately assume, sort of a clean slate in case you make any goofs during your training." "Wait, other apprentices?" Torai looked up at her teacher, who was examining the outfit she'd extracted. "I thought most of the newbies went through standard training. I only got given to you for being such a fuck up. Every guild member undergoing training is considered an apprentice," Ivan told her. "It's just that very few of them get teachers. See the red trim on your shortened cloak?" He pointed to the areas despite the fact that they were nearly impossible to miss in the otherwise endless sea of black fabric that marks you as a taken apprentice. "The color matches what's on my outfit so that anyone you deal with in the guild knows who is ultimately responsible for you just by the color." Ivan shrugged. "We used to do symbols, but as fewer people took apprentices, it got to the point where just color was enough to mark who was connected to whom." Torai finished laying out her costume, and I did critically. She'd have to try it on to be sure, but from a glance it seemed to be perfectly crafted to her measurements. Since Dr. Mechanical had already gotten clothes for her, it was hardly surprising that the guild would have her new outfit tailored, but it was beginning to get her feeling a bit creeped out. It was something she supposed she'd have to get used to, though Ivan had been worried by the mysterious box in his home. But he hadn't really seemed at all surprised by its appearance. Personal limits might be something she had to learn to reevaluate if she wanted to survive in this world. "Where am I supposed to wear this to anyway?" A meeting of the guild's council. Ivan left the living room and entered the kitchen, set on getting dinner started. It had been a long, late day at the office, and he felt that a solid meal would do them both good. "They've called an impromptu meeting. As one of the 7 counselors, I am obligated to attend. As my apprentice, you are expected to come along as well." "Oh joy, you're dragging me to another meeting." Torai's mind went back to the day's activities, which had consisted almost entirely of paperwork, taking notes, and doing all she could not to fall asleep. While people droned on about things she neither knew nor cared about, Ivan turned to glare at her in action, which might have been more menacing if he wasn't holding 2 onions in his hands. Perhaps realizing the way his menace was undercut by the produce, he set the onions on the cutting board and grabbed a knife. "This is not merely another meeting as you so flippantly described it. We are talking about all 7 of the guild's counselors, discussing high-level important issues. Some guild members would give every item they own to attend such a gathering." "Cool guild members?" Torai asked. "Like guild members with a lot going on in their lives, or guild members who are super boring and probably don't have much to do?" "I've got to be honest with you, I don't buy that. A meeting is the happening place to be no matter who's there." Ivan glowered at her as he sliced the onions, clearly unworried by the fact that a slip of the knife would press it against his unguarded flesh. "It doesn't matter if it is cool or not. The council is gathering, and we both have to go, plus it would be a good opportunity for you to meet some of the other guild members. Dr. Mechanical told me that you never graduated beyond the isolation phase. You just love throwing that back in my face, don't you? Toy leaned against the wall and watched as Ivan expertly diced his onions. He didn't even bother to change out of his suit from work. Yet he seemed neither worried about stains nor inconvenience by wearing it. Sometimes, Ivan reminded Torai of the uncanny valley. He was so close to being normal. But then he would give away his strangeness in subtle, unexpected ways. Fine, so I didn't get to meet anyone besides Dr. Mechanical and the occasional trainer. Should I really be trying to make friends before we're even sure I'll survive my training? I don't see why not. Every other apprentice lives with the same knowledge that they might die, and it doesn't stop most of them from making friends. Torai choked a bit despite her mouth being empty. Wait, every apprentice has the fuck up and die sword hanging over their heads. Certainly we didn't make up the rules just for you, Ivan replied. He finished the onions and moved on to a tomato. Any potential guild member who fails to meet expectations is terminated. The only difference between you and the others is that you already came close to meeting your end. Damn, that is some pretty extreme shit right there. Ivan paused to look at his apprentice. He didn't glare at her, nor was he as disinterested as she was accustomed to for what might have been the first time. Torai thought she sensed a bit of empathy in his eyes. We are not the good guys, no matter how structured or careful our code may be. Never forget that we are an organization of criminals and potential killers. If the guild fails to neutralize threats early on, entire cities can be wiped out, and the tentative peace we've managed to cultivate becomes strained. Make no mistake, we cannot afford things like leniency or mercy. Not when dealing with the sort of people who join us. Torai nodded, and Ivan went back to preparing dinner. Sometimes she let herself forget that not everyone would be like Dr. Mechanical and Ivan, decent men who simply didn't seem to care much for playing by the rules. Come the next evening, she would probably meet true monsters. The Sword were only constrained by stronger beings, watching over them, beings like Ivan. Gliding quietly out of the kitchen, Torai headed back into the living room and began picking up her outfit from the floor. If she had to step among the serpents, she'd best make sure her own snake skin fit her properly. After dinner was eaten, and Torai had confirmed that her costume fit her, as well as everything else she'd been provided with so far, Ivan took her into the living room for their evening training. Torai didn't ask questions. She just headed toward the bookshelf and prepared to pull out Ivan's copy of the code. Not tonight, he said, stopping her before her hand closed around the book. You did well over the weekend. I think we can move to doing a weekly code review rather than spending all of our time on it. Let's begin your practical training instead. Torai kept a solemn face as she nodded and walked back over to the couch, but the ripple of heat around her betrayed her excitement and nerves at this next step in her education. The temperature rise didn't escape Ivan's notice. In fact, it was the very subject he wanted to discuss. Next to the code, control is the most important thing for any metahuman to learn. Ivan motioned for her to sit, which Torai did. Precision, power, effectiveness, subtlety, all of this comes from control. When you can use your abilities as you wish and only use them intentionally, then the options spread out before you in any given situation are multiplied exponentially. Yeah, I know, Torai said, leaning back against the couch. That's why I practiced so much when I first got my fire powers. I can light a cigarette from across a room without scorching the hand holding it. That may well be, but you can't seem to stop throwing off heat whenever you get worried or excited or experience any other sudden flux of emotion I've encountered. Besides that, I watched all your combat tapes from your time at the guild, and I was greatly underwhelmed by the amount of exploration you've done in developing your powers technique. All you did was throw fireballs or charge headlong into battle while in fire form. I don't generally use my powers in the first place. I'm like Dr. Mechanical, all about the tech. I plan on building a metasuit so advanced that it won't even matter if the wearer can turn into infernos or is somehow made of glass. And there's nothing wrong with that aspiration, Ivan said. However, until such time as you manage to complete that sort of suit, your abilities are all that distinguish you from a mundane human. You need to make the most of them and you need to have them firmly in hand, calling forth every bit of your power, is how you survive as a villain, being able to turn it off completely. Is how you survive as a civilian. My goal is to help you reach that level of control. It wasn't quite the leaping skyscrapers training Tori had been hoping for, but she was too pragmatic to deny the benefit of mastering her abilities. Truth be told, she tried on several occasions to find a cure for the cursed things turning spontaneously into infernos. Was more of a liability than an asset when dealing with complex and delicate electronics. She'd eventually gotten them in hand, but Yvonne was right in that she'd never really bothered exploring them. Her fire powers were just a thing she dealt with, not an asset she depended on. I guess I can get on board with that, Tori agreed, especially if I'm going to have to tag along with you to that office every day. Can't very well go warming up the entire building if one of the old guys slaps my ass. No, if that happens, you come directly to me, and then we go to HR. Yvonne told her our company has a zero-tolerance policy on that sort of sexual harassment. I was kidding. Sheesh, my point is that, yeah, if I'm throwing off heat unintentionally, then that's something I'd like to stop doing. The question is how I already keep myself under pretty tight reins, but I don't know how to stop something that involuntary. It's like trying to learn to stop blushing. When you get embarrassed, that is something else that you can and will learn how to do. Yvonne left the living room and entered the kitchen, returning moments later with what looked like a small lighter for controlling your power. However, we're going to start by getting you accustomed to controlling your involuntary reactions. Today you told me that your body automatically responds to damage by turning into fire, correct? Always has in the past. Tori confirmed. Excellent. Does the method matter? Cutting, smashing, slicing, etc. Well, burning doesn't work on me for obvious reasons. Tori's eyes were on Yvonne's lighter, which he was fidgeting with absent-mindedly as he stared at her. Other than that, pretty much any time I got seriously hurt, I went into fire form. That is precisely what I wanted to hear. Yvonne tossed with a lighter, which Tori snatched out of the air. Would you mind lighting that for me? She turned the device around in her hands a few times, trying to figure out just what Yvonne was up to. The lighter was made of silver metal and had a large plunger rather than the usual small wheel to flick. It was etched with a tasteful design and seemed to be well crafted. From what little Tori knew about such devices, having never been a smoker, her experience was limited to lighting candles and bonds and burners. Tori rested her thumb against the plunger, and then after one last glance at Yvonne, pressed down on it. Son of a bitch. The lighter fell to the ground as Tori's hand turned to insubstantial infernos. The shift went all the way up to her elbow, where it thankfully stopped a few feet short of the t-shirt she changed into after work. That damn thing shocked me. Need right? Yvonne asked. I had dog whip it up based on a toy my son brought home a few years ago. It should hurt but not do any lasting damage. Plus it's fireproof and tough as hell, so you won't accidentally break it. That lighter is now your training tool. I want it with you at all times, no matter where we are. The hell for Tori asked. She took a deep breath and wheeled her hand and forearm to resume their usual form. After a few seconds of concentration, they complied, and the flickering light of her fiery appendage died out. You need to learn to control your involuntary responses. Since we can't shift your emotions about easily, the best path is through pain. You would use that lighter until you can get shocked without shifting into fire form. Oh sure, that sounds just super easy. Tori bent down and picked the lighter back up, turning it over in her hands once again. Despite being unceremoniously dropped, it didn't bear as much as a single scratch. Yvonne was right. The thing was sturdy. No, it will likely be one of the most difficult tasks I ask you to undertake. Yvonne said. That's why I'm here to help. For example, just from observing what happened, I would say your first step is to focus on not overreacting. Tori glared at our teacher with a pinched expression. I'm not sorry for cursing when you tricked me with a damn shock lighter. Yvonne sighed, a long weary rasp of air that pottered out from his lips, and shook his head. Your transformation, that's where you overreacted. The only part of you being attacked was your thumb, but you shifted all the way up to your elbow. Try and focus on some doing that aspect first. Learn what it feels like when your body acts without permission, and then try to interrupt that action before it can occur. Starting with tempering the amount is easier than trying to stop it entirely. Why? I mean, I get the goal overall, but isn't going incorporeal when someone tries to hurt me a good thing? The reaction has saved my life more than once. I don't know that I want to try and get rid of it. That is actually a very practical concern. Ivan admitted he walked over and took the lighter from her, holding it in his own hands. And honestly, you probably don't want to get rid of the reflex, not entirely, but there is a keen difference between something being eradicated and something being controlled. Ivan flipped the lighter open and pressed his finger against the plunger, locking eyes with Tori as he did so. Right now my body wants to react by releasing a surge of power to destroy the thing attacking me. It's my instinct, and when I first got my abilities, it's exactly what I would have done, but instinct wouldn't explain away the shattered metal in my hand, so discipline is required to both keep me and my secret safe. Thus I allowed a small ward to materialize on my thumb, stopping the mild electrical current from entering my skin. Really, Toy looked down around his thumb to see if she could spot a telltale glow or the edge of a glyph. Indeed, Ivan raised his thumb, and she could see a small arcane pattern of light slowly fading away. Although, to be honest, the electricity of this level can't cause me pain, but you get the point of what I was trying to demonstrate. The first step is learning to limit your reaction to only the absolutely necessary. After that, you learn to will yourself not to react at all in case you ever need to. Think being truly human and vulnerable. Once you've gotten that down, you'll have the self-awareness to stop other less immediate reactions, like letting off heat involuntarily. You can ease up on the sales pitch. I get the idea, Tori said. She held at her hand, and Ivan returned the lighter to her, holding it carefully. She flicked the top open once more and stared at the plunger. Her finger crept closer to the button she knew would send a shock through her arm. But before her thumb could land upon it, she looked back up at Ivan just out of curiosity. Do you mind if I ask what exactly your power is anyway? He raised a single eyebrow. Showing neither scorn nor acceptance, Tori was slowly learning that this was Ivan's explain yourself expression, the one he used when he wanted to hear all of someone's case before making a decision. It's well, no one was ever totally sure what Fornax's power was. It was obvious he used magic. He could make these glyphs in mid-air that he used all the time, but he never seemed to cast spells, and he fought like someone with enhanced physical abilities. You just said that electricity can't hurt you, which seems like it hints at a limited invulnerability. But I've been here for days, and I've yet to see you do any sort of spell or ritual that would provide that sort of protection. It's all really confusing and interesting. So I thought I'd swing for the fences and see if you'd tell me. I haven't stared at her for several long moments before lowering his arched brow. First off, whatever Fornax's powers were have no significance. He is dead after all. Second, I said electricity of that level couldn't hurt me, not that I was immune to it entirely. Enough power can bring me down, make no mistake of that. Lastly, I keep my abilities a secret for the same reason. You should do the same. The less people know about what you can do, the more likely you are to be able to bluff them or conceal vulnerability. That said, I will tell you where my power comes from when I think you're ready. That was actually a lot more than Tori had expected to get out of him. She knew she should be grateful for it, but she couldn't quite resist the urge to push her luck a bit more. Conceal vulnerability. Does that mean that even you have a secret weak spot? The grin that spread across Ivan's face answered her question before he even spoke a single word. No, I do not. That was just a general example. He tapped the lighter in her hand, careful to avoid turning it on himself accidentally. Now get to work. It will take a lot of effort to gain control of your reactions, and I'd like you as prepared as possible for tomorrow night. Tori looked back at the device in her hand and pressed her thumb to the plunger once more. If this was the only way forward, she'd best get started down the path as quickly as possible. Even if she knew it was going to suck for a long time before it got better. Chapter 8. Tori's second day of work went better than the first, if only because it didn't require an uncomfortable meeting and a massive pile of paperwork. Instead, her morning, along with that of 2 other new hires, began with 3 hours of the system training that was mandatory for all new employees. The training centered on learning to navigate basic programs and utilize the company's proprietary software. She could appreciate the necessity for the instruction, and that it was given before any of them were asked to perform essential tasks. Unfortunately, Tori's intelligence and technical expertise allowed her to figure out each program within 15 minutes, leaving her with over 2 hours of boredom to fill as she clacked away at the keyboard and tried not to groan when the others asked questions. Despite what others in her life suspected, Torai's intelligence didn't come from any meta ability. That she was aware of it was simply a combination of having a knack for technology, an inquisitive mind, and the unwillingness to accept that any topic or material was beyond her range of comprehension. She knew how to figure out programs because she'd been researching software just as much as hardware since she was a child. Torai was a prodigy, though, that there was no doubt, but compared to the likes of Dr. Mechanical, she may as well figured out a light switch. This limitation held back many of the would-be scientists in her generation, who were certain they would not contribute anything that the meta geniuses of the world couldn't. Torai kept a more optimistic view of things. She understood that just because she couldn't make the breakthroughs others might didn't mean she couldn't add her own spin. After all, a genius may have invented the wheel, but someone with practicality thought of the axle. After the system training was done, they took a break for lunch. It was catered cold sandwiches from a nearby shop that were actually tastier than Torai expected. She made small talk with the other new hires, both of whom were men named Stan, but the age gap made it difficult to find common ground. In such a short time, when lunch ended, Torai and the Stans were brought back into their small training room to go over company policy for the rest of the day. It was still boring, but at least it was boring by nature, rather than due to Torai mastering the material. In a sense, she knew they were all suffering, and somehow that made the burden slightly more bearable. At last the day came to an end. Torai made sure to thank her instructor, a pleasant woman from HR named Barbara, who insisted everyone call her Barb. It was important to make a good first impression on anyone who did the hiring and firing. Even Torai knew that, plus they were going to be stuck together for the rest of the week. Best to keep things cordial whenever possible. After saying goodbye to the Stans, who had hit it off and were discussing the possibility of a fishing trip that weekend, Torai darted down the hallway, nearly knocking over a chair in her excitement to get to Ivan's office. Done, Torai announced, flinging her hands in the air as if she just made a touchdown. Her foot kicked the door, knocking it closed behind her. Ivan stared at her over the top of his computer monitor, then began shutting his system down for the day. Much as he wished she'd maintain a little more decorum, even Ivan hated dealing with the mandatory training sessions. Besides, her main job was to seem normal, and being glad to get done with a work day was about as normal as anyone could get. Let me power down my computer, and we can go, he told her. Torai nodded, then flopped into one of the 2 chairs Ivan's office boasted. While some took this as a mark of opulence, the chairs were in fact a mark of responsibility. They were there so that Ivan could call people into his office and have chats with them whenever they weren't living up to their potential. As Ivan liked to phrase it, often these were meant to motivate his employees so that they wouldn't fall below the threshold of tolerance and lose their jobs occasionally. However, Ivan had to fill the other chair with an HR representative and let them know that wherever they ultimately lived up to their potential, it wouldn't be with this company. What's the game plan for tonight anyway? Torai asked. Do we get picked up by a mysterious car that floats around the city? Or is there a hidden teleporter somewhere in your house that we use? I'm driving us there, Ivan said, frowning at her attempts to discuss guild matters in public. Yes, his office was warded and soundproofed in 10 different ways, but she didn't know that. Do we change here? Torai looked around the room, scanning for some secret latch or hidden closet where they could don their costumes, of course, since they'd still have to walk out to the parking lots. Strutting around in those outfits would draw a lot of unnecessary attention. We change there, Ivan told her. Masks go on once we enter the garage, and then there are changing stalls for us right inside the door. From that point on, the uniforms don't leave until we do. Exceptions can be made for fittings and potty breaks, but the masks stay on no matter what. Did you just say potty breaks? Ivan's ears reddened just a bit at the tips, and he turned back to his computer. We are still in the workplace, and proper language should be utilized at all times. Torai wasn't entirely convinced, but she decided not to rip him to heart about it. They were, after all, about to walk into a building full of dangerous people, pissing off the person she'd be looking to for guidance. Seemed like a risky move even for Torai. Why the mask emphasis though? Do none of you know who the others are? Some of us do. Others have managed to keep their identities from the majority. Full members of the guild can forego wearing a mask inside the headquarters if they should so choose as an apprentice. However, you are expected to be in mask at all times. When on official business, it's part of your training learning to separate your identities. I'm with you. The mask marks the difference between Torai and apprentice. Ivan stood from his desk reaching and grabbing a large briefcase resting beside one of the chairs. His apprentice was quick. Many of the other initiates didn't catch the symbolism until they made the transition a few times. He also knew that she'd been up late into the night practicing with the lighter, though he hadn't told her about them. The lighter had a few extra features built in along with the shocking apparatus. It also served as a GPS tracker, and it regularly broadcast data about its user to a server that only Ivan could access. That was how we knew that she shocked herself to 132 times. After going to her apartment last night, in spite of himself, Ivan was beginning to grow fond of his apprentice. She could be surly and snarky when the mood suited her, but she was also serious about learning. Once she understood the need for it, the more time he spent with her, the more he hoped he wouldn't ultimately have to kill her. The meeting would be a good testing point of that. If she could follow instructions and hold her own, there might just be hope for her. Yet if, however, she made a serious error in front of the council, then Ivan would have no choice. It would fall on him to end her. That too was the responsibility of taking on an apprentice. You brought your costume, right? Ivan asked. Started in the trunk before we left this morning. Torai said. Good. Before we leave, you can dig out the mask. I'll let you know when to put it on. Ivan stepped forward and opened the door, ending their conversation of guild matters for the time being. He strolled down the nearly empty hallway. Torai wasn't the only one happy about the end of a work day and headed for the elevators behind him. Torai matched his pace, refusing to be left behind. Morgana checked over the conference room for the 5th time, making sure everything was neat and in order. Though she was a counselor and there were robots and underlings to attend to such tasks, Morgana still liked to double-check their meeting spaces before the council actually gathered. It was her own little ritual to keep her nerves at bay. Like Wade's Sudoku or Ivan's eating, looking at the pushed-in seats, that tastefully arranged plates of food, and the immaculately clean room soothed her, allowed her to feel as though things were under control. That was a lie. Obviously, things were never truly under control in their world, and even less so in these 7 people were in the same room together. Some were old friends, some loved each other like family. But if you had dislikes, ranging from minor annoyances to outright grudges that made seating important, as any buffer that could be put between certain parties minimized the chance of a meeting turning into an outright war. With 2 exceptions, every person in the room was weak to another party's abilities, so fights could theoretically be neutralized before they got out of hand, as any experienced villain knew. However, what was doable in theory and what happened in practice were often very different things. Morgana checked the seating position around the horseshoe-shaped conference table once more, certain all was in order. Gork was closest to the door, her chair the only one raised 4 feet off the ground and triple reinforced to bear her considerable frame. Next to Gork was Zealous. Since they were nearly inseparable friends, Gork's calm demeanor also had a soothing influence on Zealous and often kept the mechanical woman from instigating a quarrel with Balaam. Ivan would be on the other side of Zealous, and next to him would be Stasis. Stasis often liked to sit with Balaam, but they goaded one another on too often, so it was best to stick her near Ivan. No one was entirely certain if Ivan's power could be the one thing to hurt Stasis, and thus far she kept her nose clean enough not to find out. After Stasis would be Wade, who got along with everyone, and then Balaam, who trod on many of the older generation's nerves. Last would be Morgana herself, taking final seat in the horseshoe, since Balaam would be offended by it, and she trusted herself not to rise to his endless antagonism. It wasn't perfect, but then again neither was the council, so this would have to suffice at least this time. They had an important subject to deal with which would ideally keep everyone focused. The general meetings were always the worst, since no one wanted to be there, and often made that fact known by acting up. Dealing with a confluence, dangerous as it could be, was at least exciting. Things might go wrong. Lives may end up on the line, and there was always the scramble to snatch up the newest recruits. Before the EHC did, once things settled down, Morgana had a feeling that at least a few members would make some of those new rookies personal apprentices once they were officially in the guild. Though nearly everyone would deny it, Ivan was still something of a trendsetter. Among the guild, rumor had already spread that he'd taken a disciple, and many of the less informed members were wondering why the other council members hadn't been allowed to do the same. It didn't matter that Ivan had done it as a favored wade or that no one else had, because the practice fell out of use. For more pragmatic options, all that mattered was that some of the other 7 felt that they were being compared to Ivan and coming up short, which was not something they could bear. She felt a bit sad for Ivan's apprentice. He might be able to handle the weight of expectation and judgment on his shoulders, but Morgana feared it would break someone so new to the guild. There was nothing to be done for it, though. Morgana took one last look around the room, helped herself to one of the catered sandwiches, and left to go put on her proper costume. The meeting would be starting soon. Torai hadn't gotten to see the guild headquarters when she was there the first time around. She'd just been escorted by Dr. Mechaniacal to various training activities and testing areas in the pork plant throughout the day, and then ultimately led to her apartment-sized quarters. In the evening, occasionally she would be brought before another individual in a full mask and costume, sometimes to talk and other times to showcase her skill, but for the most part her tenure in standard training had been a solitary existence. At the time, she'd taken it as a precaution against her learning too much information in case things didn't work out. It was only after Ivan explained how close to the precipice she'd actually been that Torai realized the true reason she'd been kept alone. Dr. Mechaniacal didn't want anyone getting attached to her in case she didn't ultimately make the cut. It was a sobering thought she tried not to dwell on as she and Ivan walked down the long metal hallway leading out of the dressing rooms. She'd gotten to see her own outfit when she tried it on the previous night, but it was her first opportunity to see Ivan in costume. It was a far cry from his Fornax outfit, which had mostly been half-ripped clothes and a blood-red mask these days. He wore a simple red and black costume with a mask that was all black save for red trim around the eyes. It was so nondescript that she wondered how he managed to stand out among the other villains, then quickly realized he was trying to do exactly the opposite of that. He wanted to be unseen, unheard, and unknown as much as possible. "Hey, wait!" Torai stopped walking, and Ivan immediately halted. "As well, are you nervous?" "Huh, no, I got this shit," Torai replied quickly. The worry in his voice had caught her off guard. She was used to casually indifferent Ivan. Seeing him show her concern was a curveball she didn't want to try and hit. "I actually just wanted to ask what I call you in there. You made a big deal about not using the F-X word, and I'm assuming you don't go by your actual name. So how do I address you while we're inside?" "You will address me as teacher," Ivan informed her back to his usual authoritative tone. "However, should you need to know it while in these walls, I am officially called pseudonym." Torai stared at him for a long moment and then began slowly clapping her gloved hands together. "Wow, you must have really strained to come up with that one. I tip my mask to you, but you know, that would break the rules about always having it on." "Your sarcasm is not appreciated," Ivan said. "I bet it's not." Torai stopped clapping and shook her head. "Geez, did you put any effort into your name at all?" "No, in fact, I did not," Ivan replied. "My goal was specifically to show how little I care about what they called me in here. I am a retired member. I do not wish to strike fear in the hearts or be known across the continents. All I want to do is the bare minimum required of someone of my station and be left alone." "Then why are we here?" Torai shied off at the last moment from her real question, asking Ivan why he'd taken her as an apprentice. If that was how he felt, it wasn't that she feared he dodged the question or lie. In fact, she knew Ivan would be completely straight with her, which was part of why she stopped herself from asking. She wasn't sure she really wanted the answer. "I mean, you keep saying you don't like this stuff, but they still call you in for emergency meetings, and you show up," Tori continued. "Is this what retirement means? You don't do the crime, but you still have to come to all the meetings. My case is special," Ivan told her. He began walking again. Torai followed, easily keeping pace with her teacher. "I was elected by the other retirees to serve on the council as their representative. That's why I'm still on a leash even though I've officially quit the game. Hang on, there are elections. I knew there was a council, but I just assumed it was occupied by whoever had the most power. Ivan gave a slight nod. That is a big part of it. No one wants a weakling representing their interests. We still choose our leaders, though once every 6 years every metahuman gets to vote based on their classification. In order to be sure that each group has an equal voice at the table, let me take a guess at this. One of the classifications is obviously people who have retired, hence you, and I'll bet another is people who build stuff like Dr. Mechanical. You're correct, Ivan replied. There are also groups for those who use magic, those with innate abilities, artificially created beings, non-human, naturally occurring beings, and those who achieve their meta status by having their bodies or genetics fundamentally altered, which makes 7. Torai paused for a moment, mulling the information around in her head. What about me? I'm genetically altered, and I plan to use gadgets like Dr. Mechanical. So which group would I get to vote in? You'll make that decision if and when you ascend to full guild membership status, Ivan told her. Around that time, you pick your group. We're not so concerned with people having a foot in more than one pool. The main issue is making sure that everyone, no matter how unique, has someone looking out for their interests. Ahead of them loomed large metal doors. Instinctively, Tori knew that beyond them was the guild, the real one, not the small section of cells she'd seen before. This time, she felt the heat rise around her as her stomach tightened. Ivan clearly noticed, but said nothing, which she was thankful for. They both knew she was working on it. Pointing out her slip UPS would do no good for either of them at this point. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. For an organization of villains, you sure do have some strange policies in place, Torai quipped, trying to keep her mind off the prospect of what lay beyond the doors. And as I've said before, there is a reason for that. Many metahumans become criminals because they see no other path forward. They have power but are still suppressed by society. Eventually, they see their abilities as their only avenue toward being heard, which leads to acting out. We created a system that emphasized giving everyone a voice because it makes them less likely to try and start an uprising. Ivan walked over to a small console and pressed his eye up to a small glowing green spot. Welcome, pseudonym. As a voice from the console spoke, the doors before them parted. Slowly they moved until the room beyond could be seen. Inside of it were several people milling about. Torai took a deep breath, gathered her willpower, and took her first steps forward into the Guild of Villains. Chapter 9. The large red-carpeted lobby wasn't quite as full as Torai had expected. She counted a half-dozen people lounging about in costumes, most either working on laptops or making small talk. Torai was about to ask Ivan for an explanation when she put the pieces together on her own. This was an emergency meeting for the council. There was no reason for a lot of the other guild members to be present. Small group made her feel a bit more at ease as Ivan continued walking forward. His aim seemed to be the large staircase at the edge of the room, though he soon veered off course. As they drew closer, it appeared he was going to at least do perfunctory gratings, if nothing else. Evening, Ivan said, walking up to a man who was at least 10 feet tall and apparently entirely made of muscle, and his conversational partner, a small fellow with dark hair dressed in a pinstripe suit. Evening to you, pseudonym. The man in the suit replied. His beady eyes wandered over to Torai, who met his gaze without wavering. So the rumors are true. You took one under your wing. Looks like Thuggernato's me. $10. The giant of man Thuggernet, it seemed, pulled a crumpled bill from a hidden pocket on his black and purple pants, and then set it down in front of the pinstriped man. I pay this under protest. I'm pretty sure you had some sort of inside information, but yet, however you want, long as I get the cash. The man in the suit swept up the bill and gingerly deposited it in his own pocket. That done, he rose and stepped toward Tori, pausing to give a deep bow. Pleasure to meet you, apprentice. My muscular companion is Thug, or not, giant of strength and speed, while my villainous moniker is why don't we just have her call you Johnny? Ivan interrupted. I don't know, Johnny replied. I mean, if she gets me mixed up with another villain or worse, one of the heroic plots, seems best to give her my proper handle. There is no one else whose code name starts with Johnny I've encountered, but there could be, especially with the Confluence NY. Who knows what new names folks will choose after they've made it to the appropriate rank? Ivan shook his head. but he did it with a sense of resigned annoyance that Torai recognized as him giving up on a pointless fight. Fine, it's your guild name, I can't stop you from using it. Much appreciated. Johnny turned back to Torai and gave another though smaller bow. As I was saying, you can feel free to call me Johnny. Though my proper code name is slightly longer, it's Johnny Three Dicks. Torai let out a noise somewhere between a snort and a cough, then quickly tried to pass it off as a chuckle. She wasn't so prudish that the name particularly offended her, but it did open up a whole slew of questions that Torai both dearly wanted to ask and very much hoped Johnny wouldn't answer. Thankfully, Ivan retook control of the situation. I still think you chose that name just to see people's faces when you said it. At any rate, I need to go greet the others. If you'll excuse us. Nice to meet you, Thuggernet said, giving Torai a wide smile and small wave, which she returned without thinking. Johnny gave her a grin too, though his was sopping with twisted humor. After parting from Johnny and Thuggernaut, I haven't introduced Torai to a group of 3 people, Kilo, Meg, and Gig, who were punching away on computers. Killer was a short man with glasses and an awkward stutter, while Meg and Gig were a pair of brunette women who looked so similar that Tori suspected they might be sisters, or at the minimum cousins. Ivan told her that they were collectively known as the Bites and handled most of the hacking and sinister software services for the guild. While each person was pleasant, they were also clearly busy, so Ivan kept the chit-chat short. The last person Ivan led her to was a young man who appeared to be in his mid-20s, sitting in front of a television, playing an 8-bit video game that Torai recognized from her childhood. Unlike most of the others, he wore no mask or costume. The only thing slightly obscuring his face were the strands of dirty blonde hair that hung down to nearly his shoulders. When Ivan spoke to him, Torai noticed an unusual note of tension in his voice. On impulse, she looked around the room and noticed that everyone else seemed to be looking at them, waiting to see what would happen. Good evening, Christoph, Ivan said. How are you doing? Pretty good, Christoph replied. He paused his game and stood up from the small chair he'd been resting in. He was tall and broad, though not as large as Ivan. Even so, as Christoph's gaze fell upon Tori, she felt a shiver run down her spine, somewhere in the depths of her mind. She remembered her grandmother saying that those feelings came when a person walked over your grave. Then as quickly as the feeling had come, it passed, and Christoph was holding out a hand to her. Nice to meet you, new apprentice. I'm Christoph. You don't seem like a bad person. Oh, you can come talk to me whenever you like. Torai accepted the handshake, noting as she did that the balloon of tension that had filled the room was rapidly deflating. Without another word, Christoph settled back into his chair and resumed his video game. Ivan took Torai by the arm and headed toward the stairs. She managed to wait until they were out of a regular person's earshot before her curiosity got the best of her. Okay, what the hell was that about? To his credit, Ivan made no attempt to pretend that something very strange hadn't just occurred. Instead, he merely lowered his voice to barely above a whisper while they ascended the carpeted stairs. Everyone in the guild has to meet Christoph during their apprenticeship. It's a time-saving device, since we don't want to spend all the effort of training someone only for Christoph to kill them the first time they meet each other. Wait, you thought that guy might have tried to kill me? Tori stopped dead on the stairs. Being deemed an irresponsible asset was one thing. She could at least see the argument in that. But putting her in front of some guy who went on random murder binges was a whole other case entirely. Not tried, succeeded, Ivan replied, his tone neutral and unapologetic. Christoph is probably amongst the most powerful metahumans alive. Villain or cape, I've dealt with a lot of heavy hitters, and he could give a run to even the most legendary of the Lord. If he decided to kill you, then no one could have stopped him, and none of us would have tried. What Christoph doesn't kill indiscriminately, apprentice. He searches your soul for a very special type of sin, and if he finds it, then his power manifests. That's the other reason we bring apprentices in front of Christoph. This is a guild for villains, not monsters. We don't want the kind of people Christoph kills walking around this planet. And we certainly don't want them in a place that is home to some of our own families. Many of us are parents after all. What the shit you're talking about? People who hurt kids? Aren't you merely scraping a knee or delivering a spanking? Won't leave the sort of staying Christoph searches for, Ivan replied. but those who kill or do lasting damage to the innocent are marked in a way that no spell or ward can camouflage. Torai's eyes widened, and she glanced back at the young man playing video games. Oh, okay, I'm with you now. But why is he here then? That sort of work seems like it puts him on the side of the capes. No doubt he'd be welcome there, except that Christoph doesn't bother with things like due process or proof. Soul gazing isn't exactly the sort of thing that's admissible in court, and even if it were, Christoph wouldn't bother submitting it. Even that might be overlooked, if not for the fact that the deaths Christoph gives are not the quick, merciful sword. Do I want to know? I've been contemplated for a moment before responding. The tamest way I've seen him kill someone was to animate their skeleton so that it caught its way out from the inside while the person was kept alive, to feel every excruciating second. Would you like to hear more than that? Not really, Tori admitted. Although knowing what the skeleton guy must have done, I do sort of want to buy Christoph a beer. A sentiment we all echoed, which is why he lives here and has his needs provided for. But Christoph is not our concern tonight, apprentice. The time for the meeting is almost at hand. Well then, let's get to hopping, Torai replied she, and Ivan ascended the stairs back on course for the clandestine meeting with the other members of the villainous council. Even in the midst of actually doing it, Torai was keenly aware of how ridiculous that all sounded. Apollo arrived late for the Alliance of Heroic Champions Congress meeting, and he was fuming as he did so in an effort to gain more notoriety and become well known. He'd made a point of recently helping some of the others with their own PR issues and debacles. That act of generosity had backfired, unfortunately, as it ultimately made him the de facto person to deal with Carl and his impossibly bad heroic champion persona. No matter how hard they tried to convince him to change identities, the man was steadfast in sticking to his current one, and his civil case had barred them from booting him just because no one liked his identity. Carl actually had to screw up to get thrown out, which made his Boy Scout clean record a point of aggravation instead of something they could laud to the public. The large doors slid open, revealing a massive conference room that surely must have been built to hold more people than sat on the current Champions Congress. Sitting at the vast wooden table was Quorum, who had a pad and pen with him, despite the fact that he never really needed to take notes. Technically, there was no one else in the room, though there were two small devices resting a few feet away from Quorum. Each was generating a holographic projection of a different symbol. One featured the two entangled atoms that represented Professor Quantum, and one had the blazing astral design that was the symbol for Lodestar. The room was silent as Apollo entered, a piece broken immediately as Quantum took notice of his entry. You're late. He didn't sound particularly perturbed by the tardiness, merely announcing it factually, as though he was saying Apollo's golden hair was curly. My sincerest apologies. Why does Knight put out some fires downtown earlier today? But then he stopped to pass out more of his informational pamphlets, and I'm sure you can guess how the media reacted. You must be kidding me. The voice was female, strong yet youthful, and emanated from the device projecting Lodestar symbol. That jackass is still registered with us. The court ruled his persona to be constitutionally protected. Free speech, replied an older man's voice, this one coming from the device with Professor Quantum symbol. So long as he adheres to our rules and does his job well, we cannot expel him from our ranks. Please, friends, Carl is not our concern tonight, Quorum said. As the only member of the Congress physically present, it fell to him to keep the discussion on topic. Admittedly, this was true even back in the days when his fellow members didn't telecommute, though that had certainly exacerbated the problem. Apollo, please take a seat and listen closely. As someone who seeks to sit on this Congress one day, tonight's meeting will be of the utmost relevance to you. We have many duties as upholders of law and order, but few quite as important as aiding those who suddenly find themselves thrust into a situation beyond their control or understanding. Of course, Sir. Apollo slid into one of the many free chairs and took out a small notebook of his own. He'd been with the AHC long enough to have dealt with these situations before, but it was his first time to see the process from the top level of management. Quorum nodded to the devices, which Apollo assumed were being fed video as well as audio. Professor Quantum, if you would start us off. Certainly, I won't bore you with all the science I use to determine my estimates, But the long and short of it is what we're all keenly aware of: a confluence is coming. And it will be here quite soon. Torai was somewhat underwhelmed by the conference room itself. Once upon a time in her childhood, she'd been brought along with her parents to work and seen more impressive ones. Certainly the table was nice, since she rather enjoyed the decor, but overall it seemed like a room that had been built to accommodate those using it, rather than impress others who might see it, which went counter to the purpose of every other conference room Tori had previously observed. The people, on the other hand, were a whole other matter. As soon as she walked, and she recognized Dr. Mechanical clad in his Meta armor for the first time since she'd first met him. He still didn't wear the helmet though, which made sense for a meeting when she thought about it. The copper-haired inventor gave her a small smile as she entered, which she returned as formally as she could manage. Torai also instantly recognized the metallic woman talking with an 8-foot-tall gray creature as Zealous. Who would want a landmark case for the rights of artificially intelligent beings? Every inventor knew the story of how Techlord, a member of AHC, had created Zealous as a sex doll, only to accidentally construct her so well that she developed free will when she sued for her freedom. It was the first time a machine was legally seen as anything more than property, and it was why every inventor now had to be sure not to make their machines so smart that they could emancipate themselves. Zealous had clearly been given a lot of equipment changes and upgrades, but she still wore the same metal face that Tori had seen in the history books. None of that explained why she was now with the Villains Guild, though Tori could make a few guesses. She'd heard Techlord hadn't taken losing his toy and having his fetishes dragged out in public view very kindly. The large person with gray skin was a stranger to Tori, as was the blonde gal wearing street clothes and chatting it up with a younger man in red and black robes. He at least looked somewhat familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd seen him. Probably from a crime scene, which he then bargained his way out of the consequences of by killing an even worse person. As though sensing her thoughts were on him, he gave her a long glance paired with a toothy smile. Torai noted that his irises were stained a deep maroon. She had no doubt the look was meant to be intimidating, which made it less effective even before being paired with Ivan. Torai hadn't been one to rattle easily. Sharing a house with a living incarnation of destruction had only increased her idea of what constituted as scary. The last person in the room, aside from Ivan and Torai, was a middle-aged woman with raven black hair and a costume done in deep reds. She made a beeline around the table, coming right up to Ivan and giving him a big hug, followed by a peck on the right cheek. "Must I schedule one of these every time I want to visit with you?" the woman asked. "It wouldn't kill you to come around here more often." Ivan nodded slightly. He seemed to be just the tiniest bit uncomfortable by this strange woman's open display of affection. Torai's suspicion was quickly confirmed when he dodged the question, entirely gesturing to her and saying, "Morgana, this is my new apprentice. Perhaps you should introduce yourself." "Apologies," she said, not seeming particularly sorry in the slightest. Still, she turned to Tori and gave a slight bow. "My name is Morgana, and I am the counselor who represents metahumans that were innately born with their abilities. It is a pleasure to meet you, apprentice." "Pleasure to meet you too." Torai wasn't entirely sure what to make of this woman, which was par for the course with nearly every other villain she'd met so far. At least Morgana seemed pleasant, and she certainly held herself with an air of earned confidence. Then again, if everyone here was on Ivan and Dr. Mechanical's level, there was no reason they shouldn't feel confident. "Sadly, I don't think there's time to do proper introductions around the room, but I can fill you in quickly," Morgana offered. She turned, pointing to Zealous and the gray-skinned creatures still deep in conversation. "Over there are Zealous the robotic one and Gork the tall one. Zealous represents artificially created beings, be they mechanical or biological, while Gork is the representative of all naturally occurring non-human and alien creatures." Torai was hoping Morgana would also elaborate on just what the hell Gork was, but she kept right on going, pointing to the lady in street clothes and the man with red eyes. "Over there are Stasis and Baum." Stasis being the woman, she represents all our metahumans who were turned via accident experiment prototype serum. "You get the idea from what I've heard about your powers. She would be your counselor. I'm actually planning on using my technical knowledge to build metasuits," Torai said quickly. Morgana shot her a look that spoke to surprise, curiosity, and perhaps just a hint of attentive interest, well then that will put you under Dr. Mechanical, who you are already acquainted with. Since he represents all our science and gadget users anyway, Bellum oversees our magic wielders regardless of the source of their power. And since you likely know that pseudonym is the representative of our retired members, that should catch you up to speed. Morgana flashed Torai a dazzling smile, nothing like the dry attempted intimidation Belima thrown her. Torai decided that she liked the woman. It took more strength to be welcoming and kind than scary. Everyone, Dr. Mechanico called, clapping his hands together. If you could all please take your seats. I think it's time we got this meeting underway. The rest of the attendees made their way around the horseshoe-shaped table, some stagging one of the provided sandwiches. As they took a seat, Morgana leaned in and gave Torai a quick hug, pausing only to whisper in her ear, "Try not to let them scare you too much, but don't forget that they are scary people." Then she was gone, hustling across the room to sit on the end of the table. Torai found herself wishing the older woman was seated nearer to Ivan, who plopped down between Zealous and Stasis. She was the first person to show Torai more than perfunctory kindness, and if the warning held any value at all, Torai was going to need every friend she could get. Chapter 10. As you all know, the reason we've called an emergency meeting is that we've got a confluence on the horizon and a much wider window than we prefer. Working with Dr. Mechanical said, I've not always found it impressive that Wade could deliver his speeches in a way that was affable, yet still held an air of authority. Leading this group was never an easy effort. Hold the reins too loosely, and they'd run wild too tightly, and they would rebel. Only Wade, with his gentle expressions and powerful mind, had managed to do it consistently. And well over the years, once or twice, he tried to get Ivan to take on leadership roles, and each attempt had been an unmedicated disaster. We've had our mystics consulting oracles and looking for portents, while the tech department analyzed data on geospatial anomaly using quantum oscillations. Dr. Mechanical continued. All signs point to the window for the confluence opening up on Thursday night and closing by Monday morning. That means we've got a little over 72 hours where the confluence could strike, and by current indications, it's going to be a doozy. That's putting it mildly. Balaam interrupted. He paused for a moment to look around the room, clearly curious to see if someone would call him out on his small act of rebellion. Those dark red eyes lingered on Ivan longer than anyone else. But when Balaam was met with silence, he continued with a slight smirk on his face. Two crystal balls cracked when their seers tried to look into the heart of the energies gathering, and from the fire that broke out this morning, I wager the AI Oracle department had issues as well. Some of the counselors turned to Zealous, who gave a slight nod, then narrowed her metallic eyes and glared at Balaam. Though she did in fact have ocular lasers, Zealous merely chose to metaphorically drill a hole in him for the slight of pointing out an issue in her department. Balaam is correct, Dr. Mechanical agreed, retaking control of his meeting. By every measure we've utilized, this confluence will be the biggest we've seen in at least a decade. That means a lot of new metals, many of whom will have extremely potent abilities. Ivan closed his eyes and tried to will away the soft voice whispering in his ear. For a sliver of a moment he thought he had succeeded, until the voice spoke again, this time louder. Psst, what's a confluence? Torai asked. Does Apprentice have something she wishes to add to the meeting? Balaam's voice was much louder than when he made his own interruption, and from the gleam in his eyes it was clear he'd been waiting for Torai to make just such an error in etiquette. Ivan readied himself to respond, but realized Torai was talking before he could get a single word out. I was asking what a confluence was. I've been in the tech world for a long time, and I've never even heard of one of these things. Torai's voice was earnest but unapologetic. It left little to object to aside from the interruption itself, which I even considered a shockingly diplomatic move from her. Oh yes, certainly, Balaam said. Let's just pause this highly important meeting so we can explain to an apprentice something that does not and likely never will concern her. Balaam motions that we pause the meeting to explain to apprentice what confluences are, and I second it. Morgana, who had been looking a bit bored off in the corner by Balaam, seemed to positively glow as she stole his dickish remark and twisted it to her use. Wait, what? Balaam's clearly rehearsed evil smile fell away. As the meaning of Morgana's statement sank in motion, has been announced and seconded. Dr. Mechaniacal said, all in favor. Ivan, zealous Morgana, and Dr. Mechaniacal raised their hands while Bellum looked around frantically as his joke quickly turned against him. Doctor, come on, I was obviously being sarcastic. The Council of Villains does not recognize sarcasm. Balaam, you were told that on your first day here. It's the only way we manage to get anything done. Dr. Mechanical replied, the motion carries. We will now pause the current discussion so that Apprentice can be brought up to speed. I would like to recognize Balaam's motion for its commitment to the continuing education of our next generation of members. Ivan barely suppressed a grin as Balaam crossed his arms and fumed silently. No doubt he was going to hold this against Torai. But since she was Ivan's apprentice, there was already inevitable enmity. Their confluence, in the simplest of definitions, is what its name would suggest. Dr. Mechanical said, turning his attention to Torai. Ivan could practically hear her straighten up to listen more closely. It is the gathering of many forces simultaneously causing unexpected reactions that can neither be predicted nor reproduced. We still don't understand what causes confluences. However, we have learned to measure the indicators of the gathering now. While many of the effects of a confluence are benign, there is one that happens with great frequency that concerns us greatly. During a confluence, the number of metahumans created increases exponentially. Not only that, but those that occur during a confluence tend to be more powerful than average. Stasis added as the counselor representing metahumans created by external elements. She was the largest expert in the effects of confluences. Most people at this table were either born during a confluence, created during one, or arrived during one. In the case of Gork, it's true of the big name capes as well. Quantum and Lodestar were both made during a potent confluence, and it's believed that Professor Quantum was part of, if not the cause of, the very first confluence we know of behind Ivan Torai. Not at her head there was scarcely a person alive, let alone a metahuman, who didn't know about Professor Quantum's famous experiment and how that had created the first known metahumans and apparently opened the doors to the creation of others. No one was quite certain what he'd unleashed that day. All they knew was that all of a sudden the hard rules of science and reality had gotten much more malleable. As such, the time during a confluence is very important for both our organization and the alliance of heroic champions. Dr. Mechaniacal said, resuming his portion of the impromptu lesson. The more metahumans that can be identified as they are created, the less wanted chaos we have as people try to adapt to their abilities. Not to mention that it certainly helps to get first choice of the new crop. So it's basically the Cape and Villain version of NFL Draft Day, only with just two sides, and you all have to be really on top of scouting, Torai said. Plus, if you fuck up, someone might level a building. That part is their problem. Balaam snickered, still slightly sulking in his corner. That part is everyone's problem, Ivan said, speaking for the first time since the meeting had begun. When new meadows do that level of damage, the capes end up making examples out of some of us to call the public's nerves. It's in our interest to minimize those instances as much as possible. Make examples out of us. You say you must be confused, little puppy. Only real villains live in any danger, and we're all strong enough to handle it this time. When Balaam's eyes flashed, there was nothing faked in his vitriol. He wasn't trying to be scary at all. He genuinely hated Ivan and had no qualms about letting it show. This, funnily enough, made him far more terrifying than when he put on his cheesy attitude to seem scary. Balaam, none of that. Dr. Mechanical's voice grew a few shades harder, a difference too slight to notice in most men. But from him, it was as blatant as if he'd aimed a gun at Balaam's face. As kind of man as he could be, Dr. Mechaniacal had not been forced to fake his own death without reason. Anyone who forgot what he was capable of was a fool, and often a short-lived one. Before Balaam could reply, Dr. Mechaniacal turned to Tori, gave her a reassuring nod, and continued with the explanation. Apprentice, your analogy was an apt one. Confluences are when we have the chance to gather top-tier talent before they are hauled away by the EHC or give in to their base urges and commit the sort of crimes that will get them courted by gangs or locked up. Thus, it is important that we have a strong system for locating new metahumans as well as dealing with them when their powers manifest. The goal for this meeting is to coordinate shifts throughout the window, trying to make sure we have the ability to mobilize as many of our people as possible once it begins. I understand. Thank you for taking the time to explain. Torai dipped her head respectfully, and Dr. Mechaniaco let a genuine smile light up his face. Most people couldn't tell the difference, but to Ivan there was no mistaking a falsehood for the genuine article. It is our duty to pass on knowledge to those younger than ourselves. But now that you've been brought up to speed, please hold all questions until after the meeting so that we can finish at a proper time. Dr. Mechaniacal turned to face the rest of the conference room, and all eyes moved to him, including the pair that didn't belong to any of the invited guests. Pardon me, is today Tuesday the 11th, and are you a clone of Wade Wyatt over the original? This voice was weathered, strained, and all too familiar to every member of the council. Only Tori found it foreign. She spun around to see who had spoken, only to let out a half-strangled gasp as her eyes fell upon the intruder. Nexus. She instinctively gripped the arms of her chair and made to rise. Ivan put his hand on her shoulder for reassurance. He would have been more surprised if she didn't have this reaction to Nexus. Even aside from his unique appearance, he was easily the most famous criminal of all time. Nexus rarely acted, but when he did, entire cities were wiped off the face of the earth. Despite the best efforts of every cape the AHC could throw at him, and even a few villains on occasion, no one had ever managed to kill or incarcerate Nexus. He could be stopped occasionally, but never taken out for good. Torai's head whipped around so quickly that her mask came loose at the corners, nearly covering her left eye. The discomfort didn't even seem to register as she stared at Ivan with an expression of naked distrust. Is he part of this organization? Not in the slightest, Ivan assured her, but no one knows how to stop him from turning up wherever he pleases, since sometimes he drops useful information. We've all learned to deal with it. Ahem, still waiting. I've gotten a little turned around, and the clone thing would help a lot. Nexus stood patiently as Torai recovered and the others sat awkwardly in their chairs. His appearance was the same as it had been since he first surfaced. Dull brown hair and a today stubble across his narrow face. He wore simple clothes and a dusty brown overcoat that nearly swallowed up his lean body. Nexus could have passed for human if not for his kaleidoscope eyes, like a sea of shattered glass, always twinkling and swirling, shifting each time they met another's gaze. Never the same twice. For all their remarkable appearance, he barely seemed to use them, head bobbing about as he stared at what appeared to be empty space. To the rest of them, no, I'm not a clone, Dr. Mechanical said at last. Really, is this one where you secretly are, but are hiding it? No, you almost always try to kill me when I ask you about it in those I could have sworn. Oh, never mind, another me found the one I was looking for. Nexus gave a slow shrug as if to say he was sorry for the interruption as he gazed idly through the room. His broken eyes fell on Ivan and Torai, his eyebrows raised ever so slightly. She's finally here. I thought she was never born. Must have just come along later than in the other ones. Already the apprentice saw. Well, that's no surprise. You always end up learning from Ivan, at least in the ones where Ivan is still alive and you're still alive. At any rate, welcome aboard. I look forward to seeing what you choose when the time comes. What in the hell are you talking about? Torai asked. Now that the initial shock had faded, she puffed herself up, determined to regain the ground she lost earlier. The metal, or the flame, of course, Nexus replied, tilting his head slightly to the side. That choice is usually inevitable, no matter how other things play out. Such a simple thing, yet it carries such consequences. Look, are you going to tell us anything about this upcoming confluence, or are you just here to dick around? Stasis was on edge. No surprise to any of her fellow counselors. They were all aware that she was the only one with cause to actually hate Nexus, and yet she was also the only one who was proven to be beyond his reach. Oh, you're here, Stasis. You should have said something earlier. Would have saved me the trouble of getting my bearings. As for your question, how could I tell you about the confluence? I can't see the future. At any rate, I was looking for a different Wade. Since that's done, I suppose I'll go try wiping out one of the surviving Tampas and see how that alters things. In the span of a blink, he was gone. There was no effect or visual cue. Nexus merely stopped being in front of them and presumably started being someplace else. Torai turned To Yvonne, who met her uncertain eyes with a simple nod, it was unnerving the first time anyone met Nexus, and often never stopped being so unsubsequent encounters. It would explain things to her. But not here. I'd like to motion that we take a 10-minute break. Before resuming the meeting, Stacy said from the way she was gripping a sandwich in front of her, Yvonne suspected that there would be at least 2 more broken pieces of equipment. By the time she'd worked off her anger in the gym, Morgana chimed in, receiving a grateful look from Stasis for the support. All those in favor, Dr. Mechanical said, calling for votes. Despite Yvonne's hopes to make it home at a decent hour, he still raised his hand in support of the short break. They all had people who pushed their buttons. He couldn't fault Stasis just because it was hers that happened to show up. It just as easily could have been Lodestar, who crashed through a wall. And then he'd have been the one needing a break, though 10 minutes would not have been nearly enough. And if we have Baron Peppermint, cover everything south of 95th Street, that should close out the schedule. Nusley Quorum finished filling in the last lines of the grid he'd drawn on his paper, sketching BP into the final unoccupied box. With all due respect to the Baron, are we certain he's capable of keeping watch over such a wide swath of land? Apollo asked. He isn't exactly what I'd consider one of our heavy hitters. I'll grant you that our new Baron Peppermint hasn't quite reached the level of his mentor, but those gumdrop minions of his mean he can have eyes and ears, relatively speaking, over a massive area, Quorum pointed out. Besides, we don't need heavy force on the ground. Most of the new metas will be scared, confused, and completely mystified by what they're suddenly able to do. Our role is to calm them down, help them come to grips with their new lives, and get them on a healthy path toward understanding. Our presence helps us recruit any of the truly powerful ones, Professor Quantum added from his teleconferencing device. Once they feel a sense of debt toward us, it becomes all the more difficult to turn down all requests that they join our alliance. All these years, and PQ is still just as heartless as always. Lodestorm might have meant this to be a good-natured ribbing, but the weariness in her voice made Apollo feel as though it were likely more honest than she meant it to be. Not heartless, merely objective, Professor Quantum rebutted. The more we get on our side now, the fewer are likely to become serious threats later down the line. You seem to have forgotten many of the occasions when I had to go haul criminals out of their Metamax cells to help us bring down one of our own Lone Stars. Snapped back. Their arch-nemesis wound up being all that kept certain cities on the map. This is not about good or evil. Quantum's voice was a combination of the other two, both detached and passionate in a way that made Apollo's head hurt. If he thought about it too long, it was easy to understand how Quorum could be of many minds about something, but many voices was a bit harder to deal with. What choices a person makes are their own. Our goal is to keep them from giving into the panic when confronted with an unexpected twist in the world. They knew once they have control of their faculties, whether they use their new powers to help or harm is a decision only they are capable of making. But until that time, it is on us to help them through the terror that is first becoming meta. I don't have to remind any of you what it was like when you first turned. Apollo actually would have loved to hear those reminders, both because he was hungry for more information on the members of the Congress, and because his own turning story hadn't been traumatic in the least. He just knocked over a jar at the museum, had a surreal dream, like encounter with the real sun god, and woken up with his powers fully juiced up. For a scrawny kid with no special traits to get incredible powers and appeals suddenly, well, it was pretty much the opposite of traumatic. You're right. Lodestar said over her device, bringing Apollo back to the moment at hand. No one should have to go through that alone. I'm sorry I can't be there in person to help out with the patrol. It will be fine, Quantum said. Our own Apollo is volunteered to take many of the shifts himself, easily covering any gaps we might have had in the schedule. Keep it up, young man, and you may just get your wish granted. Yet Professor Quantum said. Apollo merely nodded his head humbly, as if the duty were nothing more than an afterthought. In truth, it was nearly all he could think about day in and day out. It was no secret that Lodestar was on her way out. She hadn't been seen in public for over 7 years, and it had been a solid for since she came to the AHC base. Sooner or later she'd retire officially, and when that day came, Apollo had to make certain that he was the only viable candidate to replace her. All of his beautiful, glorious plans depended on it. Chapter 11. It was well after midnight by the time Ivan and Torai finally pulled into the driveway. She'd been largely silent throughout the rest of the meeting, either cowed by the sudden appearance of Nexus or bored by the minutiae of coordinating a readied response. Among all of the council's departments, Ivan had been braced for a myriad of questions. Once they were out the door, however, her embargo on words had continued as they changed from their costumes and drove across the city. Torai exited the car before he could say anything, not that Ivan had anything he planned to say, and made a beeline right for the house. At least she didn't slam the door as she entered. That would have certainly gotten a few of the neighbors interested. Ivan stepped through the front door to find Tori standing only a few feet away waiting for him. Taking the cue, Ivan quickly locked the door and conjured a few words, adding some to keep sounding on top of those for security. So far she'd been exceptionally controlled, especially for her. But there was no sense in taking unnecessary risks. Once they were sealed and Ivan gave her a slight nod, it was all the permission Tori needed. What the fuck was that? I'm not crazy, right? That was Nexus, one of the world's most wanted terrorists. We're not talking about you or Dr. Mechanical people who just robbed companies or started fights with capes. Nexus is bad, I mean really terrible. He's killed thousands of people and no one even knows why. And you all barely batted an eye when he came sauntering in through the front door. Torai slumped onto the couch, the ever-present fight in her eyes slowly beginning to dim as she stared up at him. I even could see it hitting her. At long last, she'd been a criminal when Wade recruited her, but it was only a means to an end. When she signed up for the guild, she'd no doubt expected to rub elbows with people like herself and Dr. Mechanical. She was finally beginning to understand that living in this realm, a place outside of law and society, meant that she shared it with more than just the opportunistic and the brash. She was also in the same world as some truly evil motherfuckers. Nexus isn't a friend, neither of mine nor anyone at the guild, Ivan said. He made a point to keep his voice as even as always. It wouldn't do either of them any favors to seem like he was cuddling her in this moment. But he's impossible to kill or capture so far as we know, which means we have no way of stopping him when he pops in. For whatever reason, he likes us more than the capes, so he comes around every so often to drop cryptic clues and ask insane questions. Do not for a single moment think that any of us would call that man a friend, let alone an ally. Honestly, if Ivan had been lying, it would have been the most effortless one he ever told. Torai was in so deep she desperately wanted to believe that the organization had some lines it refused to cross that would at least give her something, a sense of morality to hang on to. It's the absolute truth, he told her, because it was. But make no mistake, we do have members whose death tolls, while smaller than Nexus's, are still considerable. Nexus could be a member of our guild were he willing to follow the code and pay the appropriate dues. It is not morality that bars him, only his own impulsive actions. Torai's face, which had begun to fill with life as Ivan told her that Nexus was not a friend, deflated. It was as if he had drained the very hope from her smile, which he was keenly aware that he had in a way. I've told you this before, apprentice, we are not good people. Our guild is not the place where those of strong morality and goodness come to lay their heads. We are villains, rogues, and scoundrels, the people we bring into our folder of that ilk as well. That is the organization that found you. That is what you seek to join. Never under any circumstances should you delude yourself about what we and you are. Jesus, Ivan, I didn't want something like this. I know I don't have the cleanest record. Maybe I'm too quick with a punch or casual about theft, but I'm not that bad. I don't know if I can do this, even if death is waiting for me. On the chance that I fail, I don't know if I can live the rest of my life surrounded by that sort of people. Torai turned her head to the ground and slowly rubbed her left hand with her right one. In the short time they come together, Ivan realized it was the first time he'd seen her completely let her guard down. It was good to know that she could when the occasion demanded it. Some people got too stuck behind their walls and were unable to break free even when they desperately wanted to. If you thought you could handle it, I'd be worried. Ivan walked across the living room, heading for the bookshelf. Torai, what did I tell you was the most important thing that I could teach you? As my apprentice, the code, she replied automatically. He drilled it into her endlessly. Since her arrival, in no small part, is preparation for precisely this moment. That's right, the code, the law that all members of the guild follow. People who have no care for the laws of religion, man, or society, are still bound by the ones we have set down for the vast majority of our members. It is the only set of rules they respect, let alone obey. Ivan took his worn, leather-bound copy of the code off the shelf and walked back over to Torai. All members of the guild, regardless of who they were before recruitment, are bound to the code, or else. He held it out to her, the book steady in the care of Ivan's powerful grip. Slowly, with the soft light of comprehension beginning to glow in her eyes, Torai reached out and took it from him. The first of us who were set free weren't the worst of the lot. Though we were some of the most powerful, more than anything I think we valued freedom and adventure over society's regulations. Perhaps in another time, we have been cowboys or pirates or settlers. Sadly, when you pair the kind of power we had with that spirit and youth, you often end up with criminals. But after being chained down, we saw that our kind needed some rules, even if they were only bare bones, so that we could have that freedom we craved so dearly. In the course of it, we also realized that some matters would never be cowed by the threats of those chained by law. They would only respond to the thing. They respected power. In that way, the guild was founded to guide those of us who sought freedom and to contain those of us who sought destruction. Torai held the book in her hand and stared at Ivan with an expression he'd yet to encounter on her face. He'd seen near glimpses of it when she glanced at Wade, but never had such sentiment been turned in his direction. It wouldn't be until later that night, when sleep evaded him as it often did after a Nexus visit, that Ivan would begin to suspect the truth behind her expression. It was admiration. The code is the most important thing I can teach. It's the most important thing you can learn. It's the most important thing that guild has ever produced, and upholding it is the most important job you will ever have should you become a member. Sort of seems like you're doing the cape's work for them, Torai noted. She held the book tightly, and as she did, the weight that it dragged her down seemed to lift, if only a pound at a time. Keeping want and destruction in check is everyone's work, Ivan replied. I don't want some sociopath wiping out my home, or my friends, or my family, any more than a human would. Besides, the capes aren't allowed to dish out the sort of penalties we can. Our jobs are entirely different. I'm beginning to see that, Torai said. She pulled herself off the couch in a single fluid move, tucking the book under her arm. As she did so, I'm going to hit the hay. We've got work in the morning. After all, spoken like a true mundane assistant, I'm verging on proud. Ivan smiled at her, not because he felt particularly cheerful, but because he knew she needed it. Tough as Torai was facing, some truths required a bit of support. But tomorrow evening I want to learn more about the guild, she continued, and about Nexus. Since he said a lot of weird stuff, you didn't seem fazed by it all. I'm guessing you've got more information on him than the masses. Why would you want to know more about that man? Because he's not one of us. Which means he could easily be an enemy one day. I'm a thinker. Remember, I like to go into these situations with as much information as possible. Ivan said nothing but gave her a polite nod. It was a good answer, and that made it a good reason. She wasn't wrong either. No one knew when, but it was always possible that Nexus could make himself an enemy. When that day came, they were all better served with a few countermeasures, or at least plans in place. Oh, one question before I head out, though I'll probably forget if I wait, Torai said, turning around from her truck to the garage apartment. That Baum guy clearly hates her guts, and I'm sure there's a story there. But why did he keep referring to you as a dog? He called you little puppy like 3 times. And when your water went down the wrong pipe, he suggested you had kennel cough. The hell is that about? Ivan suppressed a sigh. He'd expected her to be a student enough to pick up on that. Of course, that didn't always mean he was happy to be right. Balaam, along with some other members of the guild, like to refer to the retired members as beaten dogs. They feel that the only way for a villain to retire is in the permanent graveyard fashion. Anything less is seen as weakness, as though we had the fight kicked out of us and have gone home to lick our wounds. Great. So on top of unstoppable monsters and heartless killers, you also have run of them douchebags. Torai shook her head, sending her dark hair tumbling about. Tell me that if it came down to it, you could at least beat that guy. Counselors are forbidden from actually doing battle with one another in all but the most extreme of circumstances. Ivan told her. I sort of figured that when no one threw a punch tonight, but I'm not talking about next week. Just some magical hypothetical time and place occurs and you could scrap it out. Would you win in that very unlikely situation, assuming I could safely engage him without betraying the code I helped? Right, or the guild I helped create? Yvonne paused. Torai twirled her finger in the air, the universal sign to get on with it. Generally, as a rule, he avoided bragging, but as Yvonne contemplated his answer, he realized that he had no qualms with merely telling his apprentice a truthful answer to her question. In that case, I would whip the shit out of him. Torai raised her eyebrows and let out a low whistle. Now that's what a girl wants to hear from her teacher. Unlike Yvonne and Torai, Balaam hadn't gone right home after the meeting was over. Instead, he'd headed down to his department and begun doling out assignments for the upcoming confluence. Magic users were by a large nocturnal bunch, so his task was far easier to accomplish while the sun was down. Of course, if he were asked about it by any of the other counselors, Balaam would have claimed he did it because he didn't need rest when top priority events like these were at hand. Once all the mystical messages, teleported whispers, and emails had been sent out, Balaam retired to his quarters inside the guild's offices. They were spacious, and he'd spent a fair bit of effort customizing them. Once he earned the penthouse-level accommodations that came with a seat on the council, blood-red walls decorated with tasteful pieces of art that were either stolen or expert reproductions ran throughout the space. In truth, Balaam would have preferred something a little more color-neutral, but certain sacrifices were necessary when one had an image to keep up. His furniture, at least, had a more modern flair that suited his sensibilities. Decor was one thing, but he refused to compromise on comfort. Since decadence was sort of evilish, he felt like this suited his persona well enough to get away with it. And if it didn't, then so be it. One of the perks of the position he'd worked so hard to attain was that he was allowed to break rank on occasion. He was the one people had to impress, not vice versa. A quick shower purged away the day, and Balaam was debating between reading his weathered ancient tome of a spell book or watching reality television when a sharp needle of pain flashed behind his right eye. Most men would have been alarmed by the sudden discomfort, but Balaam merely grumbled to himself as he went to his work desk and pulled a silver mirror from a carefully padded black box in the bottom drawer. Unlike the majority of the bubbles and trinkets he'd either inherited, acquired, or stolen, this mirror was a true artifact. Most magical items had merely been given some modicum of enchantment by a competent mage, but the mirror resting before him had an actual magic core inside that powered it, as did its twin. The set comprised one of the most valuable pieces ever to have entered Balaam's collection. He got an excellent use out of the twin mirrors since almost to the moment he acquired them, the pain throbbed again, and Balaam bit back a curse. He could have set any manner of notification spell for when the mirror's twin called out, but he'd chosen pain for many reasons, the most important of which was that it was something only he could perceive. Sounds were overheard, glowing rooms noticed, but pain belonged only to its owner. The moment he rested his hands on the mirror's cool, slick surface, the ache faded into nothing more than a memory. Took you long enough. The voice filled his head and caused his fingers to tingle, but otherwise was nothing more than a phantom. No need to be snippy. I've had quite the busy day. Though Balaam could hear these words as he spoke them, no sound actually left his mouth. Instead, it carried through his body into the mirror and filled the mind of the recipient, just as their voice came to him, as if the confluence draws near. And it seems that this will be the biggest we've borne witness to. There is no question about that. We're going to see a lot of new metas, though only time will tell whether or not they are actually top tier, quality or quantity. So long as we get enough, I think we'll finally have what we need to make our move. I like the enthusiasm, but I'm going to see what we actually reel in before I start planning the fish fry. As soon as the words were out of his mouth, Balaam wished he could reclaim them. That was an idiom of the river-dwelling child. He'd been not the mystical master of the occult. He was accurate, if a bit oddly stated. We'll see what sort of crap the confluence reaps, then make our plans from there. But I must tell you, I'm growing impatient at all this waiting. You and I both. Balaam agreed, thankful that his partner had let the phrase pass largely unremarked on, and a bit jealous of the much cooler reaping analogy. Living in the shadows, hiding our glory at every turn. This guild is scarcely any better than suiting him and his ilk. Our tails have been tucked between our legs for far too long. It is time We reclaim the pride that is rightfully ours. Couldn't agree with you more. Soon we can move. But first we'll see what gifts the confluence delivers, then let's cross our fingers." Bellum replied, and hoped that the next few days proved to be very, very interesting. Chapter 12. Much as Torai loathed to admit it, she was getting the hang of being an office drone. The work wasn't challenging, not for most employees, and not for someone who'd been able to build functioning robotic cars before she'd tested out of the 3rd grade. The hard part was bearing through the pointlessness of it all. So much of Yvonne's work, and therefore her work, fell into the category of metrics forms files, and hours of people's days were dedicated to tracking what they and those in their departments were doing Wednesday morning during a period where she had nothing to do but tried to look busy. Torai did some rough number crunching and estimated that no fewer than 200 billable hours were being pissed away every week on such tasks. When she brought it up to Yvonne, he simply nodded, then told her she'd lowballed some of the values she used for calculations. Realizing that much of her job was pointless had been a bitter pill, though Torai was able to take great comfort of the knowledge that for her, thankfully, it was nothing more than the bland coating disguising her exciting true life. She wasn't sure how the others in the office managed to cope with such a harsh reality, though the bloodshot eyes and obvious hangovers sported by many gave her a solid guess. Donald seemed to find relief in video games, which had taken Torai all of half a day to find out. Aside from the figurines he kept on his desk, Donald also liked to wax on at length about Legacy World, the MMO he spent great swats of his free time playing, adding in that he kept a handheld device to play during his lunch hour, which was actually a carefully timed 35 minutes, and Donald couldn't have been more obvious in his geek ray. Unless he showed up to work dressed like his game avatar. Strangely, Torai found she enjoyed working next to Donald in spite of his passion for games, or perhaps even because of it. Dealing with Yvonne and the others in the guild could be tiring, and for the last several years she'd been around no one but ruthless criminals and petty inventors. Sometimes even people who fell into both categories. It was nice dealing with someone as straightforward as Donald. There was no hidden agenda or unseemly secrets. The man simply loved his games and was happy to share that with anyone who would talk to him. Plus, it was nice chatting with someone who wasn't entirely technologically incompetent. Donald certainly wouldn't be able to keep up with her or Dr. Mechaniacal. But as he described his new computer setup over their Thursday morning coffee, Torai found herself somewhat impressed by the amount of technical acumen he'd put into creating it. Anyway, the last piece comes in tonight, and that's the power supply. By the time I log in for my guild's raid, I'm going to be sporting a system that no one short of a tech company can rival. Donald boasted. He took a sip from his coffee mug and then quickly pulled it away from his mouth. Torai was keeping count, and in the time she'd been at the company, Donald had burned his tongue on his morning coffee no fewer than 8 times. She drank from her own, unbothered by the degree of heat a mere recently boiled liquid can impart. Even if it had been scalding, Torai would have barely noticed. She didn't consider her powers to come with many perks, but being essentially fireproof was useful, especially for someone who tinkered about in a lab so much. Why do you need that much processing power? Any mid-range desktop can run Legacy World no problem. Hell, they ported it to the new Indigo game system. If a console can handle it, your computer sure could. Torai hadn't actually played the game herself, but she'd done some light research in the interest of keeping conversations flowing with her cube mate. Torai had also looked up local gastropubs, dog shows, and rare kinds of tea in order to fit in well with those she met in the office. Yvonne had hardly approved. Donald stared at her as though she just suggested he scrap all of his gear and start over as a level 1 character. It's not about just being able to run it, it's about being the best. Every advantage you can get, every drop you manage to snag that bumps your stats, every bit of lag they have, and you don't, all of it is essential to becoming the strongest player on the server. There are people out there with higher levels and better gear than me. So while I level up the software part slowly, I'm also doing my best to keep ahead on hardware. In a strange way, Torai got what he meant. Being an inventor out on one's own meant struggling against people with entire corporations working for them. The odds were stacked infinitely in their favor. So she had to grab on to every advantage she could. Donald had his overclocked computer. She had a guild of semi-murderous villains. Wait, how are you not at max level? Yet that game has been out for 2 years. Torai said. Donald blew in his coffee and took a tentative sip. This time, it didn't cause him to wince in pain, so the burn count stayed at 8. There was an expansion release this week. People who don't have jobs got to play for days on end. But I'm stuck coming here, so I can only play for like 12 hours a day. Torai did some quick math and realized that after 8 hours at the office plus some time for driving, that meant Donald was only sleeping 2 to 3 hours a night. She marveled that he hadn't slammed a coffee drip straight into his veins. But it's not all bad. Donald continued to raise levels, and new dungeons came with a whole slew of new gear. My guild was so far behind the others in terms of top-tier equipment that we have never caught up. All the old stuff is pretty much useless. Now it's an even playing field as we all try and get the new top-of-the-line stuff. You sound weirdly happy for someone who just had all of their previous hard work invalidated by a single expansion, Torai pointed out. I guess I could see it that way, but I prefer to think of it as a new challenge. Besides, if I want a game I could just win and be done with, I play through one of the Blaster Brass sequels again, and then those are fun mostly because they always keep going. Donald glanced down at the small digital watch on his wrist. Toria thought it was a joke or ironic statement when she first caught sight at the black plastic band, but it seemed Donald actually saw use in wearing a timepiece despite his cell phone being perfectly able to tell him the current time. Darn, we need to head back to our desk, Donald said. Break ends in 3 minutes. Torai sighed, but picked up her mug and rose from the small plastic table they've been sitting at in the break room. If she and Donald weren't checked back in at their computers by the time those 3 minutes were up, the scheduling software would peg them as being out of compliance with their timetables. Her fingers edged as she thought about how easy it would be to modify the programming so that she was no longer chained to a schedule. But she resisted. In a workplace full of computer people, someone had surely beaten her to the punch, and no doubt the company had safeguards in place. Much as Tori believed she could get through them, that wouldn't really be in the spirit of blending in. Instead, she took her coffee back to her desk and logged in. Like the good little intern she was so obviously, I'm spending my weekend testing the system and maxing out my level, Donald said, plopping down in his chair next to her. What are you going to do with yours? Might go check out the town, Torai said. In truth, she was either going to be by Ivan's side dealing with the confluence or at a guild location, beginning her next round of combat training. It all depended on how things went down on the upside, at least. Either option seemed more exciting than another day of office fraudery. This is really short notice. The woman on the other end of the line was terse, which was to be expected. But it still made Ivan want to dig his hands into the side of his desk. He resisted, partially because such displays of power would raise far too many unnecessary eyebrows, and partially because he was quite fond of his desk. He'd worked hard to rise high enough in the company to warrant a nice one. I recognize that, and I've already apologized. Believe me, the last thing I want to do is go without seeing them, but I'm afraid there's no way for me to get out of this work event. I'm just asking to switch weekends, please. Janet huffed on the other end of the phone. A sound he knew all too well was accompanied by a roll of the eyes and a soft toss of her dark hair. He felt for his ex-wife. Truly he did. They had never been meant to be tied together in any lasting capacity. She'd been going through a bad boy phase. He was about as bad as they came. Once Rick was born and Ivan was freed from prison, they tried to make an honest go of it, which was how Beth came along. Even so, it became clear within a few years that they were only making each other miserable. Now she was connected to a man she had nothing in common with save for children they both loved, and was burdened with keeping his secret from those same offspring. It wasn't a fun position for anyone, let alone when the ex-husband in question was an internationally known criminal. Fine, she said at last. One has been wanting to check out the museum's new post-metal art exhibit, and it closes this weekend anyway. He'll be glad we can bring the kids along. Just don't make a habit out of this, okay? Ivan winced inwardly. That had sadly been the easy part of the conversation. Next came the real hurdle. Actually, why don't you and the kids and one, of course, take a mini vacation there's an amusement park that just opened outside New Denver. I went ahead and grabbed VIP passes for everyone go, and have a fun time. Think of it as my apology for the inconvenience. Ivan, what are hell static and shuffling filled the phone as Janet relocated to somewhere he assumed was more private. When she spoke again, her voice was a hushed whisper. Ivan, are you ditching your children for a thing? I am not ditching them. We are trading weekends. Ivan snapped. He knew better than to take her bait, but the insinuation that he was trying to be rid of his kids irked him. After a few deep breaths to calm down, he tried again. Listen, Janet, I'm not sure what you think a thing is, and I don't feel like over the phone is a great place to talk about it. This is just an act of goodwill from me. Even if you don't accept, I think it's good for the kids to get away once in a while, see new towns, get some real life experience. Really taking them anywhere outside Ridge City would probably be good for them this weekend. Janet's silence stretched for several moments, and Ivan feared she was trying to build enough steam to protest his suggestion. Thankfully, when she finally spoke again, it was with a tone of acceptance, albeit a still hushed and whispered acceptance. Maybe that's a good idea. Perhaps we should even take a long weekend if needed. Ivan had little love in his heart for his ex-wife, but he was constantly thankful that she was smart and pragmatic. She might not know much about what he did with the guild these days, but Janet still trusted that when he said to get the kids out of town, it was for a good reason. I'd leave this afternoon if you can. No one learns on a Friday after all. As for coming back, they'll probably have all the experience they need by Sunday evening. Just pay attention. I'm certain you'll know if they need longer. We'll be sure to do that, Janet said, her tone back at a normal conversational level. Ivan hung up and let out a soft sigh of relief. He would have done whatever it took to get them out of town. During a confluence, metahumans would be all over, many with powers they had no idea how to control. Even with the capes about trying to keep the peace, there would be some casualties. There always were. Between the needs of the guild and dealing with Torai, Ivan couldn't secretly watch over his family like he had so many times before. Better to get them clear than see them hurt or worse turned into matters. The last thing Ivan wanted was for his children to get powers and eventuality that would make them viable targets for the many enemies he'd racked up over the years. As humans, they were safe, and Ivan aimed to keep them that way. That tended to, he checked his schedule, a paper one, that he had the perk of managing himself rather than having his time tracked by a computer. It was a light day in terms of meetings, which was actually unfortunate. Now that his family was safe, Ivan didn't want to dwell on the other issue that lay heavily on his mind, namely the risks of having an untested apprentice during a confluence. The tall man rose from his desk and picked up an empty coffee mug. If the schedule refused to keep him busy, he'd just have to go check in on his employees. They were bound to have enough problems and excuses to at least help him stay mildly entertained.